Why is this history going to be so important to you? The survival secrets of our earliest ancestors, eating to live in the time before meat was discovered. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more history videos in the future. Imagine a world that existed more than 3 million years ago, a vast and untamed landscape across the ancient plains and woodlands of Africa where the very first steps of our lineage were being taken. In this distant era, the beings who walked upon the earth did so on two legs, their bodies adapted to a life of constant movement across open ground and through scattered trees. They were smaller than those who would come after, with strong jaws and teeth designed for grinding and chewing the tough gifts of the land. These early ancestors faced a world without any understanding that flesh from other creatures could sustain them. Animals moved around them as part of the living tapestry of danger and distance, creatures to be avoided rather than approached, for no knowledge existed of turning them into nourishment. Survival depended entirely on what the earth itself offered up through roots, fruits, leaves, and seeds. Every day, every month, every turning of the seasons demanded endless searching, gathering, and careful preparation of plant life to fuel the body through long journeys and harsh changes. Let us travel back into that time and walk alongside them as they rose with the first light filtering through the canopy. Dawn broke over a mosaic of woodlands giving way to grassy expanses, where rivers wound slowly and waterholes gathered life. The air carried the scent of ripening figs and the earthy dampness of soil after rain. Our ancestors stirred from their resting places in the low branches or sheltered thickets, groups of perhaps 20 or 30 moving together for safety and shared eyes on the land. They did not linger long in one spot, for the food they needed was scattered and required constant travel. With hands freed by their upright stance, they began the day's work immediately, fingers probing the ground for signs of hidden bounty beneath the surface. The primary foods that kept them alive were the abundant fruits hanging from the branches of trees and shrubs. Soft, sweet figs and berries clustered in the wetter months, providing quick energy after the night's rest. They climbed with agile limbs, reaching high into the foliage to pluck what was ready, eating some on the spot and carrying others in their hands or tucked into natural pouches of leaves. These fruits were not always plentiful. They ripened in cycles tied to the rains, so the groups learned the patterns of the trees, returning to familiar groves when the signs in the sky and the ground told them the time was right. When fruits were scarce, they turned to the leaves of young shoots and flowering plants, chewing them slowly to extract every bit of moisture and nourishment. The leaves were often fibrous and bitter, but their jaws, built wide and powerful, ground them down over long hours of steady eating. Deeper in their daily search lay the true foundation of survival, the roots and tubers buried in the soil. These underground stores, swollen with starches and water, were the lifeline during drier times. Using sharpened sticks or strong fingers, they dug into the earth around known plants, pulling up thick, pale roots that could be gnawed raw or softened by rubbing between stones. Some tubers grew deep, requiring hours of effort to reach, but once freed they offered sustained energy that fruits alone could not provide. The group spread out in loose formation, calling to one another with simple sounds when a rich patch was found, sharing the labor of digging so that all could eat before the sun climbed too high. Insects that crawled among the roots or under bark added occasional variety, small crunchy forms gathered by the handful and consumed quickly for their dense nourishment. As the morning wore on, the rhythm of the day settled into steady movement. They walked miles across the landscape, their bipedal gait allowing them to cover ground efficiently while scanning for the next meal. No single food sustained them for long. They mixed what they found, balancing the quick sugars of fruits with the lasting fullness of roots. Water was gathered from streams or licked from leaves heavy with dew, for thirst came often in the growing heat. By midday, when the sun burned strongest, they sought shade under broad trees or in rocky outcrops, resting while continuing to chew on gathered stores. The young ones stayed close to the elders, learning by watching how to spot the right plants, how to test a root for freshness by its smell and firmness, how to avoid those that carried hidden bitterness or caused discomfort. Sharing was natural in these moments. A large tuber broken apart and passed around strengthened the bonds that kept the group together against the isolation of the wild. The challenges of a single day were many, yet they pressed on because stopping meant weakness. Predators roamed the same grounds, large cats and hyena-like creatures that saw these upright walkers as potential prey rather than equals. The ancestors stayed alert, climbing to safety at the first distant sounds or using their numbers to create noise and movement that discouraged close approaches. Animals in general were kept at a distance. There was no bond, no understanding of kinship or use beyond the instinctive wariness that preserved life. The land itself could turn hostile with sudden floods or drying winds that withered the plants overnight. Yet through it all, the body adapted. Teeth wore down gradually from the constant grinding of tough fibers, but new growth and strong jaws met the demand. The stomach processed large volumes of plant matter, extracting what it could from low-nutrient foods by spending most of the daylight hours in the act of eating and moving. As one day blended into the next, the weeks unfolded with the turning of the seasons. In the wet season, when rains soaked the earth and turned the grasslands green, abundance ruled. Streams overflowed, fruits multiplied on every branch, and fresh shoots pushed up everywhere. Groups could linger longer in one rich valley, gathering more than needed for the moment and carrying extras to temporary camps. The young grew stronger on this bounty, their bodies filling out as they learned the paths to the best groves. Energy levels rose, allowing longer treks to explore new areas where unfamiliar plants might offer untapped stores. It was a time of relative ease, when the constant pressure of hunger eased and the focus could turn to caring for the smallest members of the group, carrying them while foraging or resting together in the cool evenings. But the dry season always followed, bringing months of hardship that tested every adaptation. Waterholes shrank, fruits withered on the branches, and leaves turned brittle and scarce. The ancestors moved farther and farther in search of remaining green patches or deeper roots that still held moisture. Tubers became the mainstay, dug from hardening soil that blistered the hands and required greater effort. They followed the courses of rivers that still flowed, or climbed higher into wooded hills where shade preserved some plants longer. Hunger gnawed constantly, and the body drew on stored reserves built during the wet times. Weakness could set in if the search failed for too many days, yet the groups persisted by spreading out in wider patterns and calling out discoveries so the whole could benefit. Some plants offered succulents with thick, water-filled stems that could be split open for a precious drink. Seeds from certain grasses, gathered by beating the stalks against rocks or hands, provided small but vital bursts of energy when chewed thoroughly. Through these alternating seasons, the years accumulated in patterns they came to recognize. Each cycle taught lessons passed through observation and imitation. A particularly dry year might force a longer migration to a distant valley remembered from before, where reliable tubers grew even when others failed. The ancestors learned the signs of the land, the color of certain leaves that signaled ripe roots below, the way birds flocked to fruiting trees, the feel of soil that promised hidden stores. Their teeth and jaws, shaped over generations for this exact life of grinding plants, allowed them to process foods that would defeat lesser mouths. Bodies grew lean but resilient, capable of walking vast distances without the need for constant heavy meals. In the evenings around small clusters in the trees, quiet sounds and gestures reinforced the knowledge, ensuring the young carried the ways forward. Yet even in the best of years, survival was never guaranteed. A sudden drought could strip the land bare for longer than expected, forcing the groups to split temporarily or risk conflict over shrinking resources. The animals that shared the landscape remained distant threats or neutral presences. No thought existed of drawing closer or finding value in their forms. The focus remained fixed on the plants that grew from the soil and hung from the branches, the only known path to continued life. Days stretched into weeks of relentless searching, months of careful rationing, and years of adaptation to the land's unpredictable rhythm. Through it all, the upright walk, the clever hands, and the growing awareness of patterns allowed them to endure where others might have faltered. As the years turned into decades and generations replaced one another, these early ancestors spread slowly across the changing landscapes. Some groups found themselves in more open savannas where grasses and sedges offered new possibilities, their seeds and stems adding to the gathered stores. Others stayed closer to the woodlands, relying on the familiar fruits and leaves that had sustained their forebears. The body itself began subtle shifts over time, jaws remaining strong for the tough work while legs lengthened for better travel. Every meal, every successful dig, every shared route reinforced the fragile thread of existence. They lived in a world where the only sustenance came from the patient harvest of what the earth provided, with no knowledge yet of any other way. The days demanded constant effort, the months required foresight and movement, and the years built a deep intimacy with the cycles of growth and scarcity. This was the foundation of survival in that ancient time, a life woven entirely from the plants that surrounded them. The groups rose each morning not knowing if the search would yield enough, yet they pressed forward because the alternative was unimaginable. In the next part of this history, we will follow them deeper into the specific plants that became their daily companions and the ways they navigated the longest dry periods that threatened to break even the strongest among them. The story continues as the land itself began to change, pulling them toward new horizons in their endless quest for nourishment. Among the many plants that sustained these early ancestors, certain varieties stood out as daily companions that shaped their movements across the ancient terrain. High in the branches of fig trees, the soft, fleshy fruits swelled after rains, their sweet pulp offering quick energy that revived tired bodies. These figs were not uniform. Some trees produced smaller, darker fruits with intense flavor, while others yielded larger, paler ones that stored better when carried. The groups learned to recognize the shape of the leaves and the texture of the bark from a distance, directing their morning paths toward promising groves. When the figs were not yet ripe, they turned to the young leaves of the same trees, which could be stripped by hand and chewed to release their milder juices. Lower to the ground, berry bushes provided another vital layer of sustenance. Clusters of small, dark berries grew in thorny thickets along riverbanks and in clearings where sunlight reached the soil. Gathering them required careful work, as the thorns could scratch the skin, but the reward was worth the effort. These berries were often eaten immediately because they spoiled quickly, their juices staining fingers and providing both moisture and sugars during the hottest hours. In seasons of plenty, the women and older children would fill their hands repeatedly, passing handfuls to the younger ones who waited nearby. The true backbone of their existence, however, remained the underground world of tubers and roots. Different kinds offered different benefits. Some were long and thin, growing just beneath the surface and easily pulled after loosening the soil with a stick. These provided crisp texture and mild flavor when eaten raw. Others grew much deeper and thicker, bulbous forms that held large stores of starch accumulated over months. Reaching these required persistent digging, sometimes for an hour or more at a single spot, using both hands and sharpened branches to break through hardened layers. Once extracted, the outer skin was peeled away with fingers or teeth, revealing the white inner flesh that could be chewed for a long time, releasing steady energy. Not all plants were safe. The ancestors developed keen awareness of which growths to avoid. Some leaves carried a sharp bitterness that caused the mouth to pucker and the stomach to turn if too many were consumed. Certain roots had rough exteriors hiding milky sap that brought discomfort. Through trial observed across generations, they learned the visual signs, the vein patterns on leaves, the smell when a stem was broken, the color of the soil where safe plants thrived. This knowledge was never written but carried in memory and demonstrated daily as elders guided the young to the right patches while steering them away from dangerous ones. During the longest dry periods, when many plants withered and the earth cracked under the sun, survival strategies became more refined. The groups would leave their familiar woodlands and travel along ancient river courses where underground water sustained some vegetation longer. Succulent plants with thick, fleshy stems became precious finds. These could be split open with strong hands or stones, yielding cool, watery pulp that quenched thirst when streams ran dry. Seeds from hardy grasses that survived in open patches were another emergency food. The stalks were beaten against rocks or shaken vigorously so that the tiny grains fell onto flat stones, then gathered carefully and ground between two rocks into a coarse paste that could be eaten slowly. Social cooperation reached its highest point during these hard months. The group no longer foraged individually but moved in coordinated patterns, with some members scouting ahead for green patches while others stayed with the children and elders. When a good stand of tubers was discovered, everyone converged to share the labor. The largest roots were divided into portions according to need, ensuring the weakest received their share first. Sounds and gestures communicated findings across distances, creating a network of support that multiplied the chances of success. In the evenings, as they settled in temporary resting places, the gathered foods were pooled and distributed again, strengthening the ties that held the small community together. The land itself was not static. Over many generations, the climate slowly shifted. Areas that once held dense woodlands began to open up, with grasses spreading across former forest floors. This change forced the ancestors to adapt their searching patterns. They ventured more often into these emerging grassy expanses, discovering new plants that grew in full sun. Tall grasses offered seeds that, while small, could be collected in greater quantities when several worked together. Certain low shrubs in these areas produced hard-shelled pods that, when cracked, revealed edible inner parts. The transition was gradual, but it pulled some groups farther from the old tree cover and into landscapes where the sky felt larger and the horizon stretched wider. The physical demands of this life left their mark. Legs grew stronger for the long daily walks between foraging sites. Hands developed greater dexterity for digging, peeling, and carrying. Jaws remained powerful, working for many hours each day to break down the fibrous materials. Bodies learned to function on varying amounts of food, storing energy when possible and conserving it when necessary. Yet the constant pressure of finding enough plant matter to sustain everyone created an existence of perpetual motion and vigilance. Even as they adapted to these new open areas, the core way of life remained unchanged. Every meal still came from the patient gathering of fruits, leaves, roots, seeds, and succulents. Animals continued to be avoided rather than pursued, their presence noted only as potential danger or competition for the same watering places. The days consisted of searching and processing, the months of tracking seasonal changes across widening territories, and the years of passing this hard-won knowledge to the next generation. As some groups pushed deeper into these changing grasslands, they encountered both new opportunities and greater risks. The plants were different, the water sources more scattered, and the need for careful planning became even more essential. In the next part, we will follow those who ventured into these more open landscapes and discover how they developed new ways to locate and prepare the scattered plant foods that allowed them to survive where others could not. As the woodlands thinned and the horizon stretched farther than any eye had previously followed, small bands of these early ancestors stepped cautiously into the emerging grasslands. The trees that had once sheltered their daily searches now stood in isolated clusters, like distant landmarks against a sea of swaying stalks. The air felt drier, the sun more direct, and the ground underfoot shifted from soft leaf litter to firmer soil dotted with tough grasses. Yet the need for nourishment remained the same, and so they adapted their eyes, their steps, and their hands to this new expanse. No longer could they depend solely on the clustered fruits and deep shaded roots of the old forests. Instead, they learned to scan the open ground for faint patterns that betrayed hidden bounty, turning what could have been a barren journey into a calculated harvest across miles of sky-exposed terrain. The first new companions in this landscape were the seeds of the tall grasses that now dominated the plains. These grew in vast patches where the soil had been softened by earlier rains, their slender stalks topped with nodding heads heavy with tiny grains. To locate them, the groups developed the habit of climbing the occasional lone tree or rocky rise at dawn, using the height to spot the subtle color shifts across the land. A patch of grass turning from bright green to a golden hue signaled ripeness, visible from far away in the clear morning light. They would set off in that direction immediately, covering ground with their steady two-legged stride, pausing only to check the wind for any sign of distant water that might support even richer growth. Once at the patch, the work began in earnest. Hands moved methodically along the stalks, stripping the seed heads with a twisting motion or beating them against a flat stone carried for the purpose. The grains fell in a soft shower onto a spread of broad leaves, collected carefully because every single one mattered in this more spread-out world. Preparation of these seeds required patience and newly refined techniques. The tiny grains were too small to chew effectively on their own, so the ancestors placed them on broad, flat rocks and used rounded stones to grind them in slow, circular motions. This created a coarse meal that could be moistened with dew or the juice of a succulent stem and formed into small, portable cakes. These cakes traveled well in the hands or tucked into folds of bark, providing sustained energy during long treks between patches. In drier stretches, when moisture was scarce, the meal was simply chewed dry, the grinding action of the jaws working alongside the stone tools to break down the tough outer husks. Over weeks of practice, certain individuals became especially skilled at this grinding, their hands developing calluses that protected them during the repetitive motion, and the group learned to share these tasks so that no one's strength was wasted. Scattered among the grasses stood low acacia-like shrubs bearing hard-shelled pods. These pods hung in clusters, their outer covering tough and woody, but inside lay rows of beans that swelled with starch after the rains. Finding them demanded a different kind of vigilance. The ancestors noticed that certain birds with sharp beaks often gathered around these shrubs when the pods were ready, their calls and fluttering providing an audible and visual cue from a distance. Following the birds became a reliable strategy, leading the group to stands of shrubs that might otherwise have been missed in the vastness. Once located, the pods were twisted free by strong fingers or tapped gently with a stick to loosen them. Cracking the shells required skill. A sharp stone was used to strike along the seam, splitting the pod cleanly so the inner beans could be extracted without crushing the precious contents. These beans were then pounded lightly between stones to soften their texture, releasing a nutty flavor that complemented the milder grass seeds. Eaten in combination, the two foods balanced each other, the seeds offering quick energy and the beans providing longer-lasting fullness that carried the body through the heat of midday. Tubers in the open land differed from their woodland cousins. They grew deeper and more sporadically, often beneath the shelter of grass clumps where the soil retained a bit more moisture. The search involved probing the ground with sharpened digging sticks, testing for the slight give that indicated a swollen root below. When a patch was found, the entire group would converge, taking turns at the labor so that blisters did not slow anyone down. The extracted tubers were larger here, sometimes as thick as an arm, their flesh pale and fibrous. They were peeled with teeth and fingernails, then broken into chunks and shared immediately or carried wrapped in leaves for later. In particularly dry months, these tubers became the primary water source as well, their inner pulp yielding a cool, starchy liquid when chewed thoroughly. The rhythm of a single day in this open country followed the sun with greater precision than before. Dawn light revealed the distant patches, and the group moved out quickly, covering 3 or 4 miles before the heat built. By mid-morning they would be harvesting, the sounds of beating stalks and grinding stones mixing with the rustle of grass in the breeze. When the sun stood highest, they sought whatever shade a lone tree or tall termite mound could offer, resting while continuing to process the morning's collection. Afternoon brought renewed travel toward the next promising sign, perhaps a darker line of vegetation hinting at a seasonal stream bed where succulents clustered. Evening found them in a temporary shelter among rocks or low bushes, pooling the day's finds and distributing portions according to age and need. The young learned by imitation, their small hands practicing the grinding motion on miniature stones, while elders pointed out the color of a ripe seed head or the shape of a pod ready to crack. As weeks turned into months, the open landscape imposed its own seasonal cadence. The approach of rains was anticipated by the gathering of clouds on the horizon, and the sudden greening of distant slopes. Groups would migrate toward these areas in advance, following remembered paths marked by particular rock formations or the alignment of certain solitary trees. During the wet months, the grasses grew thick and fast, seed heads multiplying until entire valleys shimmered with golden promise. Harvests were abundant enough that extra meal could be dried in the sun on flat stones and stored in natural crevices for the harder times ahead. The bodies of the people filled out slightly, their energy allowing longer explorations and the care of infants who could now be carried farther without fear of immediate shortage. The dry months that followed tested every new skill. Grass turned brittle, seeds scattered on the wind, and tubers retreated deeper into the hardening earth. Water became the guiding force. The ancestors followed the faint trails of dried stream beds, digging in the lowest points for any remaining moisture held in the soil around deep-rooted plants. Succulent stems, thick and pale green, were prized above all, split open to reveal watery interiors that could be sucked slowly to ease thirst. The grinding of seeds became more laborious as the grains grew scarcer, yet the groups persisted, widening their daily circuits until they sometimes walked 8 or 9 miles in a single day. When a good find occurred, signals were passed through sharp calls that carried across the open ground, drawing everyone together to share the labor and the reward. In the longest dry stretches, some bands split temporarily into smaller units to cover more territory, reuniting at known watering points when the moon had completed its cycle. Over the turning of years, these adaptations deepened. Generations born in the grasslands developed legs slightly longer for the sustained walking, eyes sharper for spotting color changes from afar, and hands more adept at the precise motions of cracking and grinding. Knowledge of the land accumulated in layers. One elder might remember that a particular rocky outcrop always sheltered a reliable tuber patch even after 3 dry seasons, while another could read the angle of the wind to predict where seeds would collect in drifts. Children absorbed these lessons during the long treks, their questions answered with demonstrations rather than words. The groups grew more coordinated, establishing loose circuits that brought them back to favored valleys at the same season each year, ensuring that the land had time to recover between visits. Yet the open country carried its own constant pressures. With fewer trees, shade was precious and predators could be seen from greater distances, requiring heightened alertness. The ancestors learned to move in tighter formations during the hottest hours and to choose resting spots that offered quick escape routes to higher ground. Competition for the best patches sometimes arose when 2 bands converged on the same stand of ripening grass, resolved through gestures and shared portions rather than conflict. Through it all, the focus remained unwavering. Every meal still came from the patient gathering and careful processing of what the earth offered, with no thought yet of any other source of sustenance. The physical toll was steady, but met with growing resilience. Jaws worked longer hours on the tougher grass seeds and pod beans, teeth showing the gradual wear of constant grinding, yet remaining strong enough for the task. Stomachs adapted to the larger volumes of fibrous material, extracting every possible nutrient through the slow rhythm of eating and moving. Even in the leanest years, when rains failed and the land lay brown for months longer than usual, the combination of stored meal, deep tubers, and succulent stems carried them through until the clouds returned and the grasses stirred once more. As these bands pushed even farther across the widening plains, following the promise of greener horizons each rainy season, they encountered entirely new varieties of plants that demanded further innovation in location and preparation. The story deepens in the next part as we walk with them into those farther reaches and see how the discovery of additional seed types, leaf varieties, and root forms refine their survival strategies even more, allowing them to thrive in landscapes that had once seemed too vast and unforgiving to sustain life. Pushing beyond the familiar open grasslands, the small bands now entered rolling hills and wider floodplains where the earth rose and fell in gentle waves, dotted with occasional rocky ridges that broke the endless sea of vegetation. Here the air carried a different scent, drier yet laced with the faint mineral tang of exposed soil after sporadic showers. The horizon stretched so far that the eye could follow the progress of rain clouds for an entire morning, guiding their steps toward patches that promised renewal. In these farther reaches, the plants themselves changed character, presenting new challenges and new opportunities that demanded fresh ways of seeing, touching, and processing the land's offerings. The ancestors did not hesitate. Their legs had grown accustomed to long distances, their hands to precise work, and their memories to storing the subtle signs that meant survival. One of the first new discoveries was a variety of tiny seeds clustered on slender stalks that rose no higher than the knee in the low-lying basins where seasonal water once pooled. These seeds were finer than any they had encountered before, almost powdery when shaken loose, yet they grew in such vast numbers that a single morning's harvest could fill both hands many times over. Locating them required a new technique of observation. At first light, the groups would pause on the crest of a low ridge and study the way the early sun caught the dew on the stalks. A silvery shimmer across a wide area revealed a promising stand. They moved quietly, spreading out in a wide arc so as not to trample the delicate growth, then used flat pieces of bark or broad leaves as trays, sweeping the stalks gently so the seeds cascaded onto the surface without scattering to the wind. Once collected, the seeds were so minute that ordinary grinding stones proved inefficient. The ancestors experimented with smoother, flatter rocks, rubbing in smaller circles with lighter pressure until the grains broke down into an almost silky meal. This meal could be moistened with the juice squeezed from nearby succulent leaves and patted into thin, flat portions that dried quickly in the sun, becoming lightweight and long-lasting stores that could be carried for days without spoiling. These fine seeds were never eaten alone. They were combined with another new find, broad, fleshy leaves that grew in rosettes close to the ground near the rocky ridges. The leaves were larger than any previously known, their surfaces slightly fuzzy and capable of holding morning dew like tiny cups. Harvesting them involved careful selection. Only the youngest, innermost leaves were taken, for the outer ones had grown tough and bitter from exposure. The chosen leaves were rolled between the palms to crush their fibers, releasing a mild, slightly sweet sap that served both as flavor and moisture. When mixed with the fine seed meal, the combination created a paste that satisfied longer than either food alone, providing the body with steady energy for the afternoon's continued travel. The leaves also served another purpose. When laid flat and slightly wilted in the shade, they made excellent temporary wrappers for carrying extra seed meal, keeping it protected from dust and wind. Deeper in the soil of these new lands waited root forms that tested the limits of patience and strength. Unlike the bulbous tubers of the earlier grasslands, these were long, tapering roots that snaked horizontally just beneath the surface, sometimes extending for several arm lengths in a single direction. They grew beneath particular low shrubs whose leaves had a distinctive reddish tint when the plant was healthy. The ancestors learned to recognize the shrub from afar by that faint color against the greener surroundings, then followed the main stem downward with their digging sticks, tracing the root's path by the slight rise it created in the soil. Extracting one full root could occupy 2 or 3 people for nearly an hour, working in shifts so that the earth was loosened gradually without breaking the precious length. Once freed, the root was wiped clean on grass, then sliced into segments with a sharp-edged stone. The inner flesh was pale and stringy, requiring prolonged chewing to release its starchy core, but the effort yielded a slow, reliable fullness that carried the group through entire afternoons of walking. In times when water was scarce, the same roots could be gnawed slowly to draw out every drop of stored moisture, their fibers acting like natural sponges. The daily rhythm in these farther reaches took on a more deliberate pace. Dawn still brought the first scouting from high ground, but now the decisions involved greater distances. A promising shimmer of seeds might lie 2 miles away, and the group would commit to the journey without hesitation, knowing the reward would justify the effort. Mid-morning found them harvesting in concentrated silence, the only sounds the soft rustle of stalks and the rhythmic scrape of stone on stone as meal was prepared on the spot. By midday they sought the lee side of rocky ridges for shade, spreading their leaf wrappers on the ground and sharing the combined foods while watching the sky for signs of approaching weather. Afternoon travel resumed with renewed purpose, often following the line of reddish-tinted shrubs that marked reliable root zones. As the sun lowered, they chose overnight resting places in the shelter of larger rocks or shallow depressions, where the day's collection was pooled, divided according to need, and any surplus wrapped for the next morning. The young watched and imitated constantly, learning to judge the dew shimmer from a distance or to trace a hidden root by the faint ridge in the soil. Weeks blended into the seasonal cycle with greater intensity here. The approach of rains was heralded not only by clouds, but by the sudden appearance of tiny green shoots pushing through the dry earth in the basins. The bands would hasten toward these areas, arriving just as the seeds began to form, timing their arrival so perfectly that they could harvest before the stalks dried and scattered their treasure to the wind. During the wet months, the floodplains became a bounty of overlapping growth, seeds ripening in waves, leaves swelling with sap, roots lengthening beneath the moist soil. Harvests grew so abundant that the ancestors began to create small caches in natural crevices, lining them with dried leaves and covering them with flat stones to protect against animals that might disturb the stores. Energy levels rose across the group. Children grew faster, elders moved with less fatigue, and longer explorations became possible, mapping new ridges and basins for future seasons. The dry months that followed brought sharper tests. The basins cracked into hard plates, the fine seeds disappeared beneath dust, and the broad leaves shriveled to brittle husks. Yet the long, tapering roots remained the anchor. The groups widened their search patterns, sometimes walking 10 miles or more in a single day, following the line of reddish shrubs that still showed faint color even when the rest of the land had browned. Digging became harder as the soil baked, but the ancestors developed a technique of wetting the ground first with whatever dew or residual moisture they could squeeze from succulent stems, softening the earth enough to allow progress. When even the roots grew scarce, they turned to a secondary leaf variety that grew in the shade of the rocky ridges. Smaller, tougher leaves with a slightly sour taste that could be chewed in small quantities to stimulate saliva and ease the feeling of emptiness. These sour leaves were never the main food, but served as a bridge during the hardest stretches, keeping the body functioning until a new root patch was found. Over the turning of years, these new foods and techniques wove themselves into the fabric of existence. Generations born in the farther reaches developed slightly broader fingertips from the constant handling of fine seeds and a keener ability to detect the reddish tint of healthy shrubs from great distances. Knowledge accumulated in layers. One elder remembered that after 2 consecutive dry years, the long roots grew deeper but became sweeter. Another could predict the exact week when the fine seeds would reach their peak by watching the angle of the sun on the morning dew. The groups established loose seasonal circuits that spanned dozens of miles, returning to the same basins and ridges at the same moon phases each year, allowing the land time to replenish. Cooperation deepened. When a particularly rich root was uncovered, the entire band would gather, taking turns at the digging and sharing the segments immediately so that strength was restored for everyone before continuing the journey. Challenges remained constant. The open nature of the terrain meant stronger winds that could scatter seeds in moments, requiring quicker harvesting and better covering of the collection trays. Shade was rarer, so midday rests were shorter and more disciplined, the body learning to conserve energy under direct sun. Occasional encounters with other bands moving through the same valleys were resolved through gestures of sharing a small portion of meal or pointing toward an untouched ridge, preserving peace because every group understood the fragility of the resources. Through it all, the focus never wavered. Every calorie still came from the patient location, careful harvest, and meticulous preparation of seeds, leaves, and roots. No other source of sustenance had ever been imagined. The physical adaptations continued. Jaws strengthened further for the prolonged chewing of stringy roots, teeth showing even wear from the constant grinding of fine seeds. Stomachs processed larger volumes of fibrous leaves without distress. Legs lengthened subtly across generations, enabling the sustained travel these wider landscapes demanded. Even in the leanest years, when rains failed for seasons at a time and the floodplains remained dust for months, the combination of cached meal, deep roots, and the emergency sour leaves carried the bands through until the clouds returned and the earth stirred once more. As these groups ventured still farther, drawn by the sight of distant green belts that hinted at even richer valleys beyond the next line of hills, they encountered yet more diverse plant forms that would demand entirely new levels of ingenuity in location, harvest, and storage. The journey of adaptation was far from over. The land continued to reveal its secrets, and the ancestors continued to listen, watch, and learn with every step. In the following part, we will accompany them into those next valleys and witness how the introduction of entirely new categories of edible growth, combined with more sophisticated carrying and preservation methods, allowed them to establish more stable seasonal patterns across landscapes that had once appeared endless and empty. In the following part, we will accompany them into those next valleys and witness how the introduction of entirely new categories of edible growth, combined with more sophisticated carrying and preservation methods, allowed them to establish more stable seasonal patterns across landscapes that had once appeared endless and empty. Descending the long, gentle slopes that led into these sheltered valleys, the bands felt the air change around them almost at once. The wind that had whipped across the open ridges softened here, caught and held by the rising walls of earth on either side, while the ground beneath their feet grew richer and darker, fed by seasonal streams that still trickled even when the higher plains had turned to dust. The horizons no longer stretched forever. Instead, they were framed by the valley sides, creating a sense of enclosure that felt both protective and full of promise. Here the plants grew in greater variety and density than anywhere the ancestors had yet walked, offering entirely new forms of nourishment that required fresh eyes to spot, fresh hands to harvest, and fresh minds to understand how best to preserve them across the turning seasons. The groups moved more slowly now, not from fatigue but from deliberate caution, pausing often to study the new growths that rose around them in layers from the valley floor upward along the slopes. One of the most striking new categories was the hard-shelled nuts that clustered high in the scattered trees lining the valley bottoms. These trees stood taller than any they had known before, their trunks thick and their branches spreading wide, bearing clusters of round, woody nuts encased in tough outer coverings that protected the rich inner kernels from the drying winds. The ancestors quickly learned to recognize the trees from a distance by the particular shape of their leaves, broad and deeply veined, which turned a deeper green after even the lightest rain. Harvesting required new patience and teamwork. The nuts did not fall easily. The groups would gather beneath a promising tree and use long, straight branches as poles to tap gently against the higher limbs, causing only the ripest nuts to drop without damaging the tree itself. Once on the ground, the hard shells demanded a specialized technique. Flat stones were selected for their smooth surfaces, and smaller rounded pebbles were used to strike along the natural seams, cracking the casing cleanly so the kernels inside could be pried free with careful fingers. These kernels were denser and more sustaining than any seed or root previously known. A single handful could provide steady energy for half a day of steady walking. The taste was mild and slightly oily, and when chewed thoroughly, the kernels released a slow-building fullness that lingered longer than the quick sugars of fruits or the starch of tubers. To carry these precious kernels without losing a single one during the day's travel, the ancestors developed their first true carrying vessels. Broad, flexible leaves from a low-growing plant that thrived along the valley streams were collected in quantity each morning. These leaves were laid flat on the ground, layered 2 or 3 thick for strength, and then the edges were folded upward and secured with thin strips of tough grass twisted into simple cords. The resulting shallow pouches could hold several handfuls of kernels securely, and several such pouches could be slung over the shoulder or tied around the waist, freeing both hands for further gathering. When the day's travel ended, any unused kernels were carefully transferred into deeper, more protected storage pits dug into the soft valley soil and lined with the same broad leaves to keep out moisture and insects. Covered with flat stones and marked with small cairns of pebbles, these caches could remain undisturbed for weeks, allowing the group to return to the same valley later in the season and find food waiting exactly where they had left it. Alongside the nut trees grew a completely new type of leafy plant that formed dense mats across the damper ground near the streams. These leaves were smaller than the broad valley wrappers but far more numerous, growing in overlapping layers that created a living carpet. Their surfaces were slightly waxy, helping them retain moisture even on hot afternoons, and when crushed between the palms they released a cool, faintly tangy juice that refreshed the mouth and aided digestion. The ancestors learned to harvest them not by pulling the entire plant, but by pinching only the freshest top growth, leaving the roots intact so the mat would regrow quickly for future visits. These leaves were never eaten alone. Instead, they were rolled tightly around small portions of cracked nut kernels or ground seed meal, creating compact bundles that traveled without crumbling and could be chewed slowly during the hottest hours when the body needed both food and extra moisture. The combination of the waxy leaf and the dense kernel inside produced a balanced nourishment that kept energy levels steady even during the longest treks between one side of the valley and the other. Deeper into the soil of the valley floors waited yet another new root form, shorter and more clustered than the long tapering roots of the open hills. These grew in tight groups beneath particular low shrubs whose stems carried a faint reddish stripe running from base to tip. The clusters could number 20 or more individual roots in a single spot, each no thicker than a finger but packed with concentrated starch. Locating them became a skill passed quickly from elder to child. The reddish stripe on the shrub was the first sign, followed by a gentle probing of the soil around the base with a digging stick until the slight resistance of the clustered roots could be felt. Extraction was efficient. Once the first root was freed, the entire cluster tended to lift together with a single careful pull. The roots were then cleaned by rubbing them against a patch of coarse grass and broken into short lengths for immediate sharing. Their flavor was milder than anything found higher on the plains, almost sweet when chewed, and they provided a quick burst of energy that complemented the slower release of the nut kernels perfectly. The daily life in these valleys settled into a more predictable and less exhausting rhythm than the endless wandering of the open lands. Dawn light filtered softly between the valley walls, allowing the groups to rise and begin their search without the harsh glare that had forced earlier departures. They would move first to the stream edges to collect the waxy leaves and fill their new leaf pouches with the previous day's cached kernels. By mid-morning they reached the nut trees, tapping and cracking in a steady communal effort that filled the air with the soft tapping sounds and the occasional satisfied murmur when a particularly large kernel was revealed. Midday brought rest in the dappled shade beneath the same trees, where bundles of leaf-wrapped food were passed around, and the young practiced their cracking technique on smaller nuts under watchful eyes. Afternoon was reserved for digging the clustered roots near the stream beds, followed by a leisurely return to the overnight resting place with pouches full and energy still high. Evenings were spent reinforcing the leaf-lined caches, repairing the grass cords on the carrying pouches, and demonstrating to the children how to recognize the reddish striped shrubs from across the valley floor. The seasonal cycles, once so punishing, now felt more manageable. The rains arrived earlier and lingered longer within the protective walls of the valleys, turning the stream beds into gentle flows and causing the nut trees to produce heavier clusters than ever before. During these wet months, the groups could remain in one valley for many weeks, harvesting, caching, and even exploring side gullies that branched off the main floor. Surplus kernels and roots were stored in ever larger pits, some big enough to hold food for an entire band for several days, lined with multiple layers of waxy leaves and covered so carefully that they stayed fresh and free of mold. The bodies of the people responded with visible strength. Children grew taller faster, elders moved with renewed ease, and the overall pace of daily travel slowed from desperate searching to purposeful collection. When the dry months returned, the valleys still offered refuge. The nut trees held their leaves longer, providing continued shade and occasional late drops of nuts. The clustered roots retreated deeper but remained reachable because the valley soil stayed softer than the baked plains above. The waxy leaves, though fewer, could still be found near the shrinking streams, and the carrying pouches allowed the groups to transport extra portions from one cached pit to the next as they slowly shifted position along the valley length. The sophisticated preservation methods meant that even in the hardest dry stretches, no day passed entirely without food. A morning visit to a known cache would yield enough to sustain the entire band until evening. Over the turning of many years, the knowledge of these new growths and methods deepened into a rich oral tradition of observation. Elders could predict the exact week when the nut clusters would reach peak ripeness by watching the color of the tree leaves change ever so slightly. Children learned to twist the grass cords with exactly the right tension so the pouches would neither tear nor spill. The bands established semi-permanent seasonal routes that circled through a series of connected valleys, returning to each one at the same phase of the moon year after year. Cooperation became even more refined. When a particularly heavy nut tree was found, signals of sharp rhythmic calls would bring every member of the band together to share the labor and the bounty equally. The fragile thread of existence that had once been stretched so thin across the open lands now felt stronger, anchored by the variety of new edible growths and the clever ways of carrying and storing them. Yet even here the land could still test them. A sudden flood after unusually heavy rains might wash away a cache or damage the nut trees, forcing quick relocation to a neighboring valley. Strong winds could strip leaves from the waxy mats, requiring the groups to range farther along the stream beds. Through every challenge, the focus remained absolute. Every meal, every step, every season was still built entirely upon the patient discovery, careful harvest, and thoughtful preservation of what the earth itself provided. Animals remained distant presences to be avoided, their forms offering no thought of sustenance, only the ancient wariness that kept the bands safe. As the years accumulated and generations succeeded one another within these sheltered valleys, the ancestors began to sense that even farther horizons held promise. Distant glimpses of wider, greener lowlands beyond the valley mouths suggested landscapes where the variety of plant life might be richer still, where new carrying techniques and preservation methods could be refined even further. The journey of adaptation continued, pulling them gently onward. In the next part, we will follow those who first stepped out of the valleys into those broader lowlands and discover how the introduction of still more diverse edible plants, combined with the development of even more effective storage and transport innovations, allowed them to create the first truly reliable annual cycles of movement and abundance across territories that had once seemed too vast to master. The journey of adaptation continued, pulling them gently onward. In the next part, we will follow those who first stepped out of the valleys into those broader lowlands and discover how the introduction of still more diverse edible plants, combined with the development of even more effective storage and transport innovations, allowed them to create the first truly reliable annual cycles of movement and abundance across territories that had once seemed too vast to master. Emerging from the last narrow pass between two valley walls, the band stepped onto a wide, gently sloping lowland where the earth flattened into a vast shallow basin ringed far in the distance by low, hazy hills. The sky seemed to open wider here than anywhere before, yet the ground itself felt richer, more generous, layered with a mosaic of plant communities that shifted color and texture with every few hundred paces. Streams braided across the surface in slow, meandering threads, their banks lined with thicker growth than the valley floors had ever supported. The air carried a constant low hum of insects and the faint sweet scent of fermenting fallen fruit, signs that this place supported life on a scale the ancestors had only glimpsed from high vantage points. They did not rush forward. Instead, they paused for several days at the edge, observing, tasting small samples, listening to the land reveal its rhythms before committing to deeper exploration. The most immediately striking new category of growth was the sprawling vines that crept across open patches between the streams, bearing clusters of small, round, thin-skinned fruits that hung low enough to be reached without climbing. These fruits ripened in waves across the season, starting pale green, turning a deep reddish purple, then softening to an almost translucent state when fully mature. The ancestors learned to judge readiness not only by color, but by the slight give under gentle pressure from a fingertip. Harvesting became a morning ritual. Groups spread out in loose lines across a promising vine patch, moving slowly so as not to crush the delicate skins, plucking only the ripest individuals and leaving the rest for the next day or the next week. The fruits burst with juice when bitten, providing both quick hydration and a burst of natural sugars that revived the body after a night of rest. Because they spoiled within a day or two of picking, the ancestors developed the habit of eating large quantities on the spot during the peak ripening periods, filling their stomachs until the sensation of fullness lasted well into the afternoon. To extend the availability of these juicy fruits beyond their short fresh window, the bands experimented with a simple yet transformative preservation method. They selected the ripest, softest specimens and laid them in single layers on broad, flat stones that caught the full midday sun. Over several days the fruits shriveled slowly, their skins darkening and their juices concentrating into a dense, chewy mass. These sun-dried fruits could then be gathered into the leaf-lined carrying pouches developed in the valleys, now modified with an extra layer of tightly woven grass matting for better protection against moisture. The dried versions retained much of their sweetness and provided a compact, lightweight energy source that traveled far better than fresh ones, allowing the groups to carry several days' worth without fear of spoilage during long crossings between vine patches. Interspersed among the vines grew another entirely new form, tall, reed-like stalks topped with feathery seed heads that swayed in the slightest breeze. These stalks rose to twice the height of a person, their bases thick and hollow, their upper portions laden with thousands of minute, pale seeds that turned golden as they matured. Locating ripe stands required learning to read the wind patterns across the lowland. On calm mornings, the seed heads hung still and heavy, while even a light breeze caused them to ripple in waves that revealed their location from half a mile away. Harvesting involved bending the tall stalks downward with both hands, then stripping the seed heads in one smooth pull. The collected heads were piled on wide mats of overlapping leaves, then beaten gently with straight sticks until the tiny seeds showered free. These seeds were finer even than those found in the earlier floodplains, almost dust-like, yet their sheer volume meant that a single morning's work could yield enough to sustain the entire band for several days. Processing these feather seeds demanded further refinement of the grinding technique. The ancestors selected larger, flatter grinding stones, some as wide as an outstretched arm, and paired them with smaller, heavier handheld stones that allowed greater downward pressure. The seeds were poured onto the lower stone in small batches and rubbed in long, even strokes rather than tight circles, producing a finer, almost flour-like consistency. This fine meal could be mixed with a little water squeezed from succulent stems or from the juice of the thin-skinned fruits, then patted into thin, round cakes that were left to dry in the sun until hard and portable. These cakes became one of the most reliable traveling foods yet devised, lightweight, resistant to insects when wrapped tightly in grass matting, and capable of providing steady energy when nibbled slowly over many hours of walking. Beneath the surface of the lowland soil, especially near the braided streams, grew clusters of small, onion-shaped bulbs that formed tight, layered groups just below the surface. These bulbs were covered in thin, papery skins that peeled away easily, revealing crisp white flesh with a mild, slightly sharp taste. The ancestors noticed that certain birds with long beaks probed the soil around these clusters, leaving small holes that served as ready markers. Following the birds became a daily strategy, where the ground showed fresh probing marks. A quick scrape with a digging stick usually revealed the bulbs within moments. Once freed, the bulbs were eaten raw for their crisp texture and moisture, or roasted briefly by placing them near the edge of a small, smokeless fire built from dry reed stalks. Roasting softened the flesh and mellowed the sharpness, making them easier to chew and more palatable when combined with the denser nut kernels or dried fruit carried from previous stops. The carrying and storage innovations evolved rapidly in response to the sheer abundance available here. The leaf pouches grew larger and more structured. Multiple broad leaves were stitched together edge to edge using long, flexible grass fibers threaded through small holes punched with sharpened thorns. The resulting bags had reinforced bottoms and drawstring like closures made from twisted vine tendrils, allowing them to be cinched tight against dust and rain. For longer-term storage during periods when the group remained in one area for weeks, the ancestors dug deeper pits, some reaching the depth of an entire arm, and lined them with successive layers of broad leaves, then packed the dried fruit cakes, fine seed meal, and roasted bulbs inside before sealing the top with flat stones and a final covering of earth. These pits were marked with subtle arrangements of small stones or broken reed stalks, so they could be relocated even after heavy rains reshaped the surface. A single well-placed cache could hold enough preserved food to carry the band through an unexpected dry spell or a period of injury when movement was limited. Daily life in the lowlands acquired a steadier cadence than any previous landscape had allowed. Dawn brought the first walk to the nearest stream to refill leaf-wrapped water bundles and gather fresh, thin-skinned fruits for immediate consumption. Mid-morning was devoted to harvesting the tall reed seed heads or digging onion bulbs along the banks, the work shared so that everyone contributed and everyone rested in turn. By midday, the group retreated to the shade of the tallest vines or the occasional isolated tree, spreading mats and processing the morning's collection, beating seeds, peeling bulbs, laying fruits to dry, while the youngest members practiced the new knotting techniques for the reinforced bags. Afternoon travel was shorter than in the open plains, often only a mile or two to reach the next promising patch indicated by bird activity or wind ripples. Evenings were spent reinforcing storage pits, repairing bags, and sharing the day's bounty around small, carefully tended fires that provided warmth without attracting undue attention from distant animals. The seasonal patterns that emerged were the most reliable the ancestors had yet experienced. The wet months flooded the braided streams gently rather than destructively, causing the vines to explode with fruit and the reed stalks to grow thick and heavy with seeds. Harvests reached such volume that the bands could fill multiple deep caches in a single season, creating reserves that lasted well into the dry period. During the dry months, the lowland retained moisture longer than higher ground, the streams shrank but did not vanish entirely, and the onion bulbs remained accessible beneath the still damp soil near the banks. The preserved cakes and dried fruits provided a steady baseline, supplemented by whatever fresh fruits or bulbs could still be found. The groups established a wide, looping annual circuit that took them through the lowland basin in a predictable sequence, starting at the western edge when the first rains arrived, moving slowly eastward as the vines ripened, then curving back westward as the dry season deepened and the caches became the primary source. Over decades and generations, these cycles solidified into something approaching tradition. Children born in the lowlands learned the exact sequence of ripening, first the early green fruits on the vines, then the feather seeds on the reeds, then the peak of the onion bulbs, and the precise locations of the most productive patches within the basin. Elders could forecast the strength of an upcoming wet season by the thickness of the reed stalks the previous year or the depth at which the onion bulbs had grown. The reinforced carrying bags became objects of care, passed down when worn, repaired with the same grass fiber stitching techniques, and occasionally decorated with small patterns pressed into the leaf surfaces using sharpened twigs. The deep storage pits were maintained across years, sometimes reused for 3 or 4 seasons before being relocated slightly to allow the soil to rest. The physical changes across generations reflected this new stability. Bodies grew slightly stockier from the more consistent access to calorie-dense dried fruits and seed cakes. Jaws remained powerful but showed less extreme wear because roasting softened many foods and the fine meal required less grinding effort. Legs stayed long for travel but developed greater endurance for the shorter, more frequent movements within the circuit. Infants could be carried in slings made from layered leaf mats, allowing mothers to participate fully in harvesting without constant interruption. The overall pace of life eased enough that time appeared for more deliberate care of the very young and the very old, for quiet observation of the sky and the plants, for the slow accumulation of shared understanding about how this generous lowland could be tended rather than merely exploited. Challenges persisted, of course. An unusually heavy wet season could inundate low-lying caches, forcing rapid relocation of stores to higher ground along the basin edges. Prolonged dry spells still shrank the streams and reduced fresh growth, requiring stricter rationing of the preserved foods. Yet the combination of diverse plants, sophisticated preservation, and reliable annual circuits meant that outright starvation became rarer than in any previous landscape. The ancestors had learned to work with the land's abundance rather than fight against its scarcity. As the lowland cycles became familiar, some bands began to look beyond the distant hazy hills that framed the basin. Faint green bands visible on clear days suggested even broader river floodplains farther downstream, places where the variety of growth might multiply again and where the techniques of carrying, preserving, and cycling could be tested on a grander scale. The pull of exploration remained gentle but persistent. In the next part, we will journey with those who crossed those distant hills into the greater river floodplains and observe how an even wider array of edible plants, joined to increasingly complex seasonal planning, communal storage networks, and refined transport systems, permitted the establishment of the most enduring and widespread patterns of plant-based survival, yet achieved in their long history of adaptation to an ever-changing earth. We will journey with those who crossed those distant hills into the greater river floodplains and observe how an even wider array of edible plants, joined to increasingly complex seasonal planning, communal storage networks, and refined transport systems, permitted the establishment of the most enduring and widespread patterns of plant-based survival, yet achieved in their long history of adaptation to an ever-changing earth. Crossing the final low ridge that separated the broad basin from the greater river floodplains felt like stepping through a final threshold. The land dropped gradually at first, then opened into a vast, level expanse where a wide, slow-moving river wound through the center like a living vein, its waters reflecting the sky in shifting bands of silver and blue. On either side stretched kilometers of fertile silt deposited by seasonal floods, supporting layers upon layers of vegetation that rose from the water's edge in graduated zones. Dense reed marshes near the banks, then open grassy flats dotted with scattered trees, then slightly higher ground where shrubs and low woodlands thickened before giving way again to open savanna-like expanses. The air here was heavier with moisture, carrying the rich, earthy smell of wet soil and decaying plant matter even in the dry season. The ancestors paused for many days along the upper margins, sending small scouting parties forward each morning to sample, observe, and return with reports carried in gesture and simple sound. Only when the patterns of flood, growth, and retreat became clearer did the full bands commit to descending into this new domain. The river itself shaped everything. Its annual rise and fall created a predictable calendar written directly on the land. When the waters swelled after distant rains far upstream, they spread across the lower flats in a slow, shallow sheet that nourished the soil without destroying the plants rooted there. As the flood receded, It left behind a glistening layer of fine silt that fed an explosion of growth unlike anything the ancestors had witnessed before. In the wettest months, the entire floodplain became a mosaic of green, tall reeds shooting upward along the permanent channels, broad-leafed herbs carpeting the newly exposed mud, vines climbing over fallen logs, and clusters of fruit-bearing shrubs emerging from the damp ground as if summoned by the water's retreat. One of the dominant new categories in this richest zone was the tall marsh grasses whose seed heads formed dense, cylindrical clusters at the top of stems that reached well above head height. These heads were packed so tightly with small, starchy grains that a single stalk could yield more nourishment than an entire morning's harvest in the earlier lowlands. The ancestors learned to move through the reed beds in single file along the firmer paths left by previous passages, bending the tall stems downward with both arms, and then snapping the seed heads free with a quick twist. The collected heads were carried back to dry ground in the large, reinforced leaf and grass bags now standard across the bands. There the heads were spread on wide mats of woven reeds and allowed to dry fully in the sun before being threshed by beating them rhythmically against flat stones or against each other held in bundles. The resulting grains, larger and more uniform than the feather seeds of the previous basin, were winnowed by tossing handfuls into the air on breezy afternoons, letting the light chaff blow away while the heavier kernels fell back into shallow baskets fashioned from tightly interlaced reed leaves. These marsh grains became the cornerstone of the floodplain diet during and immediately after the flood season. Their higher starch content meant that smaller volumes provided more sustained energy than the finer meals of earlier landscapes. The ancestors developed a two-stage processing method. First, of course, grinding between larger paired stones to crack the outer husks, followed by a finer rubbing on smoother surfaces to produce a true flour-like consistency. This flour could be mixed with water from the river, carefully collected in leaf-lined depressions to let silt settle, and formed into small, dense balls that were then baked on flat stones near low, smokeless fires built from dry reed stalks. The resulting baked balls kept for many days without spoiling, their hard outer crust protecting the soft, nourishing interior. A single batch could sustain a band for up to a week of travel, allowing longer excursions away from the immediate riverbanks without fear of immediate hunger. Closer to the permanent river channels grew thick stands of a broad-leafed aquatic herb whose floating leaves and submerged stems were harvested in a completely different manner. The leaves were large, round, and deeply veined, capable of holding water like shallow cups even after being picked. The ancestors waded into the shallows during the early morning when the water was coolest, using long poles to pull the plants toward them without uprooting the entire colony. Only the freshest, uppermost leaves were selected. These were stacked carefully in the carrying bags between layers of dry grass to prevent bruising. On shore, the leaves were eaten fresh for their crisp texture and high water content, or laid out in the shade to wilt slightly, which concentrated their mild, slightly sweet flavor. When combined with the marsh grain flour, the wilted leaves could be chopped finely with sharp-edged stones and kneaded into the dough before baking, adding both moisture and a subtle flavor that made the otherwise plain balls more palatable during long dry stretches. Along the slightly higher, better-drained flats beyond the immediate flood zone stood groves of medium-sized trees, bearing clusters of small, oval fruits enclosed in thin, papery husks that split open when fully ripe. These fruits ripened in staggered waves across the groves, some turning bright orange while others remained green for weeks longer. The ancestors mapped each grove meticulously during the first seasons, noting which trees produced earliest, which held their fruit longest, and which yielded the largest individual pieces. Harvesting involved gentle shaking of the lower branches combined with careful hand picking of the higher ones reached by standing on natural stumps or fallen logs. The papery husks were peeled away immediately to prevent mold, revealing smooth, slightly waxy skins beneath. The flesh inside was soft and fibrous, rich in natural sugars and moisture, and could be eaten fresh or mashed into a thick paste using smooth river stones. This paste dried quickly when spread thinly on broad leaves in the sun, forming leathery sheets that could be rolled tightly and stored in the deepest caches. A single grove at peak ripeness could provide enough dried sheets to supply several bands for months if carefully rationed and combined with the more substantial marsh grain balls. The communal storage networks that emerged here represented the most sophisticated system yet. Instead of isolated pits, the ancestors began creating chains of caches spaced at regular intervals along their annual circuit. Each major grove or productive reed bed was associated with at least 2 or 3 storage sites, one near the harvest area for short-term surplus, another halfway to the next grove for mid-journey resupply, and a third closer to the dry season refuge zones on higher ground. All were dug to uniform depth, lined with multiple layers of broad aquatic leaves, chosen for their natural resistance to decay, packed with the dried fruit sheets, baked grain balls, and wilted leaf bundles, then sealed with flat river stones and a final mound of earth camouflaged with scattered reeds and small branches. Markers were subtle but consistent, 3 small stones in a triangle, or a single upright reed stalk weighted with a pebble, allowing any member of the band to relocate a cache even after heavy rains had altered the surface. These networks meant that movement across the floodplain no longer required carrying every day's food. A group could travel light, knowing reliable resupply points waited ahead. Transport systems evolved in parallel. The basic leaf and grass bags grew larger and were now carried in pairs slung across the shoulders with wide straps made from braided river reeds. For especially heavy loads, such as moving surplus from one cache to another during the wet season, the ancestors constructed simple travois-like frames, 2 long, straight poles lashed together at one end with reed cord, with cross pieces added for strength and broad leaves stretched across to form a platform. A single person could drag such a frame loaded with several days' worth of baked balls or dried fruit sheets across the flat, silty ground with far less effort than carrying the same weight by hand. These frames were left at major cache sites when not in use, maintained and repaired during return visits so they remained available season after season. The annual cycle that crystallized in the floodplains was the most stable and far-reaching yet. It began with the first rise of the river, when the bands positioned themselves on the higher flats to avoid inundation while still close enough to gather the earliest aquatic herbs as the waters advanced. As the flood peaked and then began its slow retreat, they followed the receding edge downward, harvesting the first waves of marsh grass seeds from the freshly exposed mud. Mid-wet season brought the peak of the oval fruits in the groves, when the group split temporarily into smaller units to cover multiple harvest sites simultaneously, pooling the dried sheets back at central cache chains. Late wet season and early dry season focused on the final marsh grain harvests and the preparation of baked balls in quantity. As the river shrank to its permanent channels and the ground hardened, the bands moved slowly back upward along the circuit, drawing on the spaced caches to bridge the gaps between remaining fresh growth. The dry season refuges were established on the slightly elevated ground near the permanent river bends, where deep-rooted shrubs and the last accessible aquatic herbs could still be found even when the wider flats had browned. This rhythm repeated year after year with increasing precision. Elders could forecast the timing of the river's rise by watching cloud patterns far upstream or by noting the exact date when certain reed stalks began to elongate. Children learned the locations of every cache marker within a day's walk of each major grove. Cooperation reached new levels. When a grove produced an exceptional harvest, excess was deliberately transported to neighboring bands' circuits via the travois frames, creating loose alliances based on shared knowledge of the land rather than conflict over scarce resources. The physical adaptations across generations reflected this abundance and stability. Bodies became more robust from consistent calorie intake, teeth showed balanced wear from the variety of textures, soft fresh fruits, crisp baked balls, fibrous dried sheets, and overall stamina increased from the shorter daily travel distances within a well-mapped, resource-rich circuit. Even in this generous landscape, the Earth still set limits. An unusually low flood could delay the marsh grass ripening by weeks, forcing stricter reliance on cached stores. A sudden shift in the river's main channel might inundate a cache chain, requiring rapid rediscovery and relocation of the buried surplus. Yet the diversity of plants, the sophistication of preservation and storage, and the reliability of the annual circuit meant that the bands could now endure variations that would have broken smaller, less prepared groups in earlier eras. As familiarity with the floodplain deepened over generations, some bands began to send scouts still farther downstream, where the river widened into a vast delta and the silt deposits supported even denser, more varied growth. The promise of new edible forms, combined with the possibility of linking multiple floodplain circuits into a larger, interconnected network of movement and exchange, drew them onward once more. In the following part, we will travel with those scouts into the delta reaches and witness how the encounter with an extraordinary range of aquatic, semi-aquatic, and terrestrial plants, joined to the most elaborate seasonal coordination, multi-band cache alliances, and advanced transport networks yet devised, allowed the ancestors to establish the broadest, most resilient patterns of plant-dependent survival across an immense and richly endowed landscape that marked one of the high points of their ancient way of life before any other source of nourishment had ever entered their understanding. In the following part, we will travel with those scouts into the delta reaches and witness how the encounter with an extraordinary range of aquatic, semi-aquatic, and terrestrial plants, joined to the most elaborate seasonal coordination, multi-band cache alliances, and advanced transport networks yet devised, allowed the ancestors to establish the broadest, most resilient patterns of plant-dependent survival across an immense and richly endowed landscape that marked one of the high points of their ancient way of life before any other source of nourishment had ever entered their understanding. The delta unfolded before the first scouting parties like a living map drawn in water, silt, and green. Where the great river finally surrendered to the sea, it divided into countless slow-moving channels, islands, and lagoons, each fringed with vegetation so dense and layered that the eye could scarcely take in the whole at once. The air tasted of salt on the outermost edges, yet fresher water still dominated the inner maze of waterways. Mudflats glistened under the sun between the channels, giving way to floating mats of vegetation, then to firm islands where trees rooted deeply in the rich sediment. The seasonal pulse here was gentler than the upstream floodplains, yet more complex. The river's flow never ceased entirely, but the tides from the distant sea pushed saltwater fingers inland during certain moons, then retreated to allow freshwater dominance once more. The ancestors learned these rhythms slowly, watching how the waterline shifted day by day, how certain plants flourished only when the tide was low, how others thrived precisely when the brackish mix was strongest. In the outermost channels, where salt influence was strongest, grew extensive beds of a tough, grass-like plant with long, flat blades that floated half-submerged. These blades were fibrous and slightly salty to the taste, yet when the youngest, tenderest tips were stripped away, they offered a crisp, mildly briny chew that quenched thirst almost as effectively as drinking. The ancestors waded chest deep during low tide, using long poles to pull the floating mats closer, then harvested only the pale green tips with careful pinching motions. These tips were eaten fresh on the spot for immediate refreshment, or carried back in small, tightly woven reed baskets lined with broad aquatic leaves to prevent wilting. When dried slowly in the shade of overhanging branches, the tips became leathery strips that could be rehydrated by soaking in fresh water collected from inner channels. The rehydrated version retained much of its crispness and provided a valuable source of minerals during periods when freshwater plants were temporarily scarce due to tidal shifts. Farther into the inner delta, where freshwater held sway most of the year, Vast floating islands of interwoven roots supported colonies of a round-leafed water plant whose leaves grew in perfect circles the size of open hands. These leaves were thick, almost succulent, and filled with a clear, jelly-like sap that tasted faintly sweet. The ancestors learned to approach the floating islands by swimming or poling small rafts made from bundled reed stalks lashed together with vine tendrils. Once alongside, they reached down to detach individual leaves at the base, leaving the root mat intact so the colony would regenerate. The sap-filled leaves could be bitten directly to release the cool, hydrating interior or punctured and squeezed so the liquid collected in hollow reed sections carried for that purpose. During the hottest months, when inland water sources sometimes warmed unpleasantly, these leaves became the preferred way to cool and hydrate the body. Surplus sap was carefully funneled into larger leaf containers sealed with plugs of soft mud, then buried in shallow pits shaded by overhanging trees. The buried containers kept the sap fresh for days longer than if left exposed. On the stable islands between channels grew groves of low, spreading trees whose branches drooped under the weight of heavy, pear-shaped pods that split open along one seam when ripe. Inside each pod rested rows of large, kidney-shaped seeds coated in a thin, sweet-tasting pulp. The ancestors discovered that the pulp could be sucked directly from the seed for a quick burst of energy and moisture, while the seed itself, hard and starchy, required pounding between river-rounded stones until it broke into coarse fragments. These fragments were then boiled briefly in shallow, clay-lined depressions filled with river water heated by dropping in fire-heated stones. The boiling softened the starch into a thick, porridge-like mass that could be eaten warm or allowed to cool and solidify into portable cakes. The combination of sweet pulp and starchy seed provided one of the most complete nourishments yet encountered. Rapid sugars from the pulp to revive immediate strength, followed by slow-release starch to sustain long hours of movement through the delta maze. The seasonal coordination required here reached an unprecedented level of precision. The delta's tidal influence created micro-seasons within the larger wet-dry cycle, periods of high saltwater reach that favored the fibrous blade tips and certain salt-tolerant herbs, followed by freshwater dominance that brought the floating round-leaf colonies to their peak and ripened the pear-shaped pods in waves across different islands. The ancestors developed a system of relay signals, sharp, carrying whistles combined with arrangements of colored reeds tied to prominent branches, to communicate changing conditions across wide channels. When a scout party located a newly emerged floating island rich in round leaves, the whistle pattern would summon others from neighboring islands. When a grove began dropping ripe pods, reed markers of a particular length and color were placed at agreed crossing points to guide distant bands toward the harvest. The multi-band cache alliances became the backbone of survival across this sprawling landscape. No single group could hope to monitor every productive island or grove alone. Instead, loose networks formed among bands that shared overlapping circuits. One group specialized in the outer tidal zones, harvesting and drying the fibrous blade tips in quantity and transporting them inward via raft caravans. Another focused on the inner freshwater floating mats, collecting sap and exchanging it for the outer group's dried strips. Still others concentrated on the stable island pod groves, pounding and boiling the starchy seeds into cakes that were distributed through a chain of relay caches. These caches were now constructed on raised platforms of interwoven reeds and mud, elevated above normal high tide levels and protected by overhangs of dense foliage. Each platform held dozens of tightly sealed leaf and clay containers, marked with unique combinations of reed lengths, colors, and knot patterns that identified which alliance group had contributed the contents and which groups were entitled to draw from them. The system allowed a band to travel far from its primary territory, perhaps to explore a newly forming island or to assist another group during an unusually low freshwater period, knowing that food awaited at prearranged points along the way. Transport networks reached their most advanced form in the delta. The simple travoy frames of the upstream floodplains evolved into true rafts, wider platforms of bundled reeds, reinforced with cross-lashed poles, capable of carrying several days' worth of pod cakes, dried blade tips, and sap containers across channels too wide for wading. Smaller, single-person rafts made from just 3 or 4 long reed bundles served for scouting and rapid message carrying between islands. During peak harvest seasons, flotillas of these rafts moved in coordinated patterns, transferring surplus from one alliance zone to another. When currents were favorable, the rafts drifted with minimal effort. When moving against the flow, long poles pushed from the rear or teams on shore hauled them forward with braided vine tow lines. The rafts themselves became temporary storage during transit. Surplus was lashed securely beneath woven reed mats, protected from spray and sun, then unloaded at the destination cache platform for redistribution. Daily existence within the system followed a fluid, water-centered rhythm. Dawn often found small parties poling rafts toward the outer channels for blade tip harvests during the lowest tides. Mid-morning shifted to the inner islands for round leaf collection, the work punctuated by pauses to drink sap directly from freshly detached leaves. By midday, the groups retreated to shaded platforms or dense groves, processing the morning's haul, pounding pod seeds, drying blade tips, sealing sap containers, while children practiced the whistle patterns and knot combinations that identified safe caches. Afternoon brought either continued local harvesting or raft travel to the next island in the circuit, guided by the reed markers visible from the water. Evenings were spent reinforcing platform caches, repairing rafts, and sharing the day's bounty around small fires built on clay bases to prevent sparks from igniting the surrounding reeds. The annual circuit now spanned dozens of islands and channels, looping in a slow, tidal-timed progression. It began in the inner freshwater zones during the early wet season, when round-leaf colonies swelled and sap flowed most freely. As the river's flow increased and tides pushed farther inland, the bands shifted gradually outward, following the advancing blade-tip beds and harvesting them at peak tenderness. Peak pod ripening in the stable groves marked the middle of the cycle, when raft caravans were busiest, redistributing the heavy seed cakes across the alliance network. As the dry season deepened and freshwater retreated, the circuit reversed, drawing inward again to the permanent channels where round-leaf colonies persisted longest and cached supplies bridged any gaps. The entire pattern could encompass more than 100 kilometers of waterways, yet every band knew its segment intimately, trusting the relay system to connect the whole. Across generations, this vast, interconnected way of life produced the most enduring stability the ancestors had known. Bodies adapted to the water-rich environment, skin tougher from constant wetting and drying, lungs stronger from swimming and breath holding during harvests, hands more dexterous from the fine knot work and raft lashing. Knowledge accumulated in astonishing depth. Elders could predict tidal peaks by the phase of the moon and the color of certain floating leaves. Children memorized the knot patterns of every alliance cache within a week's raft journey. Entire bands developed specialized roles: scouts who read water currents, harvesters skilled at wading deepest, processors expert in boiling and sealing. That together formed a seamless whole greater than any single group could achieve alone. Even in this richly endowed delta, the earth still tested resilience. An exceptionally high tide driven by distant storms could submerge outer caches for days, forcing rapid relocation by raft. A prolonged low-rain period upstream could weaken the freshwater flow, shrinking round-leaf colonies and requiring stricter rationing of cached pod cakes. Yet the extraordinary diversity of aquatic and semi-aquatic plants, the elaborate seasonal coordination, the multi-band alliances, and the advanced water-based transport ensured that outright scarcity remained rare. The ancestors had woven themselves into the landscape so thoroughly that survival no longer felt like a daily battle, but a sustained, collective harmony with the rhythms of water, tide, and growth. As familiarity with the delta reached its height, some scouts began to follow the outermost channels toward the true coastal margins, where the river finally met open water and new plant communities appeared along sandy spits and brackish lagoons. The promise of still more varied edible forms, combined with the possibility of extending the alliance networks beyond the delta into these transitional shores, continued to draw them forward. In the next part, we will accompany those who ventured onto the coastal edges and discover how the encounter with entirely new shoreline and dune plants, integrated into the most expansive coordination systems yet created, permitted the ancestors to push their plant-reliant existence to its widest geographical reach and greatest seasonal resilience before the long era of gathering only nourishment began to approach horizons no one yet imagined could change. We will accompany those who ventured onto the coastal edges and discover how the encounter with entirely new shoreline and dune plants, integrated into the most expansive coordination systems yet created, permitted the ancestors to push their plant-reliant existence to its widest geographical reach and greatest seasonal resilience before the long era of gathering only nourishment began to approach horizons no one yet imagined could change. The coastal margin appeared first as a thin silver line on the horizon, growing sharper with each day's raft journey down the outermost delta channels. When the scouts finally poled their reed platforms through the last narrow passage and emerged onto open water, the world changed again. The river's muddy sweetness gave way to the sharp, clean bite of salt air. Long, curving spits of pale sand stretched away on either side, backed by low dunes that rose and fell in soft ridges parallel to the shore. Beyond the dunes lay a narrow belt of scrub and low trees adapted to wind and spray, then patches of salt-tolerant grasses that gave way inland to the familiar delta vegetation. The sea itself rolled in slow, rhythmic pulses, each wave reaching farther or retreating more than the last depending on the pull of unseen forces far beyond the horizon. The ancestors felt the change in their skin and lungs almost immediately, the air heavier with minerals, the light brighter and more constant, the ground firmer underfoot yet shifting with every step on the sand. They did not rush to settle. For many days the scouting parties remained near the river mouth, camping on the highest points of the spits where fresh water could still be dug from shallow lenses beneath the sand. They watched the tides twice each day, noting how the water crept up the beach in silver tongues then withdrew, leaving glistening strands of seaweed and broken shells. They tasted small mouthfuls of everything within reach, learning quickly which growths brought refreshment and which caused the mouth to pucker or the stomach to tighten. Only after these careful observations did the larger bands begin to follow, moving in small flotillas that hugged the inner channels until they too could beach on the firmer sand and step onto this new edge of the world. Along the uppermost reach of the tides, where waves lapped only during the highest surges, grew dense carpets of a low, creeping succulent with thick, fleshy leaves shaped like tiny clubs. These leaves stored water so efficiently that even after days without rain, they remained plump and cool to the touch. The ancestors learned to harvest them by pinching off the outermost segments, leaving the central growing point intact so the plant could spread further across the sand. The leaves were eaten raw, their crisp flesh bursting with a mildly saline juice that quenched thirst far better than plain water during the hottest hours. When the midday sun became unbearable, the groups would chew these succulent segments slowly while resting in whatever shade the low dunes offered, the salt tang lingering on the tongue long after the moisture had been absorbed. Surplus leaves were gathered in quantity during the cooler morning hours and laid out on flat stones to dry partially. The half-dried versions could then be packed tightly into small reed baskets lined with dry dune grass, where they kept their hydration for several days of travel along the shore. Higher on the dunes themselves rose scattered clumps of a tall, wiry grass whose blades were narrow and rolled inward to reduce water loss. At the top of each mature stalk hung a loose, feathery panicle heavy with minute, hard seeds that rattled softly in the constant sea breeze. These seeds were smaller than any previously encountered, yet carried a dense, nutty nourishment within their tough outer coats. Harvesting required timing. The ancestors waited until the panicles turned from green to a pale straw color, then beat the stalks against broad, flat stones carried from the river mouth. The seeds showered down in fine clouds collected on reed mats spread below. Because the grains were so minute and numerous, winnowing became a delicate art. Small amounts were tossed gently into the wind, allowing the lightest chaff to blow away while the heavier kernels settled back onto the mat. The cleaned seeds were ground between small, portable stones selected for their smooth surfaces, producing a fine meal that could be moistened with succulent leaf juice and patted into thin, sun-dried wafers. These wafers traveled exceptionally well, lightweight, resistant to mold in the salty air, and providing a slow-burning energy that sustained long walks between dune systems. In the sheltered swales between the dunes grew another entirely new form, low shrubs with small, silvery leaves and clusters of tiny, berry-like drupes that ripened to a deep indigo. The leaves themselves were bitter when eaten alone but could be chewed in small quantities to stimulate saliva and ease the dryness of the throat during windy days. The drupes, however, were prized above all. Their thin skins split easily under gentle pressure, revealing a sweet tart pulp surrounding a single hard pit. The pulp was sucked directly from the fruit for immediate refreshment, while the pits were cracked between stones and the small kernel inside extracted with a sharp thorn or fingernail. These kernels were oily and rich, yielding more concentrated nourishment than the dune grass seeds. The ancestors developed a preservation method specific to these drupes. The whole fruits were mashed lightly to release the pulp, then spread thinly on broad dune grass mats and dried in the wind rather than direct sun to preserve the delicate flavor. The resulting leathery sheets could be rolled and stored in the deepest reed baskets, where they remained edible for weeks even in the humid coastal air. The most remarkable adaptation of this coastal margin was the way the ancestors integrated the new shoreline plants into their existing delta networks while expanding them outward. The river mouth camps became permanent relay points, elevated platforms now built higher on sand ridges and reinforced with driftwood poles lashed together with tough dune vines. From these hubs, regular raft and foot caravans moved in both directions, upstream into the delta to exchange dried succulent leaves and dune seed wafers for pod cakes and marsh grain balls, then back along the coast to supply newly established bands pushing farther along the spits. Cache chains extended in linear fashion parallel to the shore. Every few kilometers a low mound of sand concealed a shallow pit lined with succulent leaves, chosen for their resistance to salt, packed with mixtures of dried drupe sheets, seed wafers, and imported delta foods, then covered with driftwood and marked with arrangements of bleached shells and colored dune grass tied in distinctive knots. These coastal caches were spaced closer together than inland ones because the open terrain offered fewer natural landmarks, yet the shell markers proved reliable even after storms reshaped the beach. The coordination system grew correspondingly elaborate. Each band adopted a segment of coastline as its primary circuit, yet all shared a common tide calendar maintained by the river mouth hub. Notches cut into driftwood poles recorded the number of days between highest tides, allowing distant groups to predict when succulent leaf beds would be most accessible or when dune grass panicles would reach peak dryness. When a storm surge threatened to inundate low caches, swift runners carried bundles of colored grass along the beach, the color sequence signaling which pits needed immediate relocation to higher ground. During the windiest seasons, when sand moved in drifting curtains and obscured markers, the ancestors placed secondary guideposts, tall stakes of driftwood topped with bundles of bright dune grass, at regular intervals, creating visible lines that could be followed even in reduced visibility. Daily life along the coast followed the dual rhythm of tide and wind. Low tide at dawn brought parties to the uppermost beach for succulent harvesting, fingers moving quickly across the carpets while the sand was still cool. Mid-morning shifted to the dunes for seed beating and drupe collection, the work done in short bursts to avoid the strengthening sun. By midday, the groups retreated to wind sheltered swales or the layside of driftwood piles, processing the morning's haul, grinding seeds into meal, mashing droops into sheets, packing baskets, while chewing succulent leaves to stay hydrated. Afternoon travel occurred during the cooler onshore breeze, either along the firm wet sand near the waterline or along the dune crests where the wind had packed the surface. Evenings were spent reinforcing coastal caches, repairing baskets torn by blowing sand, and sharing the day's bounty around small fires built in shallow pits lined with stones to contain sparks. The annual circuit now stretched along tens of kilometers of shoreline, looping back at the river mouth where delta supplies could be replenished. It began with the calmer winds of the early wet season, when succulent carpets spread widest and droop clusters swelled. As the dry season deepened and winds strengthened, the circuit shifted to more sheltered swales and relied heavily on cached wafers and sheets. The highest tides of certain moons brought brief abundance to the uppermost beach, allowing intensive harvesting that filled caches for the leaner months ahead. The entire pattern was sustained by constant movement between coast and delta, the two landscapes no longer separate but linked in a single, breathing system of exchange. Across generations, this coastal existence produced the broadest geographical reach yet achieved. Bodies adapted to the new conditions, skin darkened slightly under the constant bright light, eyes narrowed against wind-blown sand, feet broadened and calloused from walking shifting surfaces. Knowledge deepened into extraordinary detail. Elders could identify the exact phase of the moon when succulent leaves reached peak water content. Children memorized the shell-knot combinations of every cache along a day's walk. Entire bands developed specialized skills. Gatherers who read tidal patterns by the angle of seaweed strands. Processors expert in wind-drying droop sheets without mold. Messengers who ran the beach routes in darkness, guided only by the sound of waves. The loose alliances grew into something resembling a distributed community. Food moved freely along the coast. Knowledge of changing conditions traveled faster than any single band, and the shared reliance on both delta abundance and shoreline resilience created a stability that could absorb even severe seasonal disruptions. Storms remained the greatest test. A powerful onshore gale could bury low caches under shifting dunes or strip succulent carpets for weeks, forcing temporary retreat to the delta channels. An extended period of high tides driven by distant weather could inundate the uppermost beach for days, delaying harvests. Yet the combination of diverse coastal plants, the linear cache chains, the tide-based coordination, and the constant link to delta resources ensured that no band ever faced complete scarcity. The ancestors had stretched their way of life across an immense arc from inland river to open sea, mastering the rhythms of water, wind, sand, and growth so thoroughly that existence felt woven into the very fabric of the landscape. As the coastal circuit stabilized and generations succeeded one another along the curving shore, some scouts began to follow the beach farther in both directions, where the dunes grew higher and new plant communities appeared in the transition zones between sand and scrub. The promise of additional edible forms, combined with the possibility of extending the coastal delta network into these farther margins, continued to exert its quiet pull. In the next part, we will journey with those who pressed onward along the lengthening coastline and observe how the integration of still more specialized dune, scrub, and back beach plants, supported by the most far-flung coordination, largest-scale cache systems, and most refined movement patterns yet developed, allowed the ancestors to achieve the absolute widest distribution and most enduring resilience of their ancient plant-gathering existence, creating patterns of survival that spanned entire regions and persisted across countless seasons in a world still defined solely by what the earth itself offered up. We will journey with those who pressed onward along the lengthening coastline and observe how the integration of still more specialized dune, scrub, and back beach plants, supported by the most far-flung coordination, largest-scale cache systems, and most refined movement patterns yet developed, allowed the ancestors to achieve the absolute widest distribution and most enduring resilience of their ancient plant-gathering existence. Creating patterns of survival that spanned entire regions and persisted across countless seasons in a world still defined solely by what the earth itself offered up. The shoreline curved gently northward and southward from the river mouth, stretching into distances that no single generation could walk in a lifetime. The sand grew finer in some stretches, coarser in others. Dunes rose higher in places where prevailing winds piled them into long, undulating ridges, while in sheltered bays the beach flattened into wide, firm expanses interrupted only by occasional rock outcrops worn smooth by endless waves. Behind the primary dune line lay a transitional zone of low scrub, thorny bushes, salt-stunted trees, and patches of wiry herbs, before the land rose again into rolling hinterlands that echoed the earlier savannas but carried the constant breath of the sea. The ancestors moved along this edge with deliberate slowness, establishing temporary beachhead camps every few days' walk, each one serving as a seed from which new circuits could grow. They learned the coastline not as a single line but as a ribbon of micro-habitats, each stretch offering its own suite of plants tuned to subtle differences in wind exposure, salt spray, soil moisture, and tidal reach. In the highest, most wind-scoured dune crests grew sparse clusters of a low, cushion-forming plant with tiny, scale-like leaves tightly pressed against the sand. These leaves were so small they could be harvested only by scraping handfuls of the entire cushion, yet within that compact mass lay a surprising density of starchy tissue. The ancestors developed a specialized technique. They knelt on the windward side where sand had accumulated less, used flat shells to scoop beneath the cushion, and lifted the whole mass free in one motion. Back at camp, the cushions were shaken over reed mats to remove clinging grains, then pounded lightly between stones until the scale leaves separated from the denser core. The cores, pale, almost floury when fully processed, were mixed with a little seawater, allowed to stand so salt-settled, and shaped into small, sun-hardened pellets. These pellets were extraordinarily compact and long-lasting. A single handful could sustain an individual for 2 full days of steady walking when nibbled sparingly, making them ideal for the longest coastal traverses where fresh growth might be days apart. Lower on the dune slopes, where sand was more stable, spread another specialized form, sprawling mats of a vine-like creeper with heart-shaped leaves and occasional clusters of small, globular seed pods. The leaves were thick and slightly rubbery, capable of withstanding salt wind without wilting, and carried a mild, almost metallic flavor when chewed. The seed pods, when mature, split open to reveal rows of flat, disc-shaped seeds with a tough, papery covering. Harvesting the leaves required no tools beyond the hands. Runners were followed along the sand until a dense patch was found, then the freshest growth pinched away in short sections. The seeds demanded more care. Pods were collected just as they began to dry and split, then stored in loose weave grass bags until fully open, after which the disc seeds were shaken free and winnowed by gentle tossing in the sea breeze. Both leaves and seeds were combined in a single preparation. Leaves were torn into strips and laid flat, disc seeds scattered over them, then the whole rolled tightly and allowed to dry in the shade of a driftwood windbreak. The resulting rolls kept for months, providing both moisture from the leaves and concentrated starch from the seeds during periods when succulent carpets were temporarily buried by shifting dunes. In the scrub belt immediately behind the dunes grew a taller shrub with leathery, lance-shaped leaves and clusters of small, hard-shelled nuts that clung stubbornly to the branches. These nuts were smaller than the valley varieties encountered generations earlier but far denser, their kernels rich in oils that left a lingering smoothness on the tongue. The ancestors learned to recognize the shrubs by the way their leaves caught the light, silvery green on one side, duller beneath, and by the faint rattling sound the nuts made when the wind moved the branches. Collection involved careful twisting of the clusters. Too much force snapped the stems and scattered the nuts into the undergrowth. Once gathered, the shells were cracked using small beach pebbles selected for their rounded edges, then the kernels extracted and lightly roasted over coals made from scrub twigs. The roasting released a nutty aroma that carried far in the still air, sometimes serving as an unintentional signal to distant bands that a good patch had been found. Roasted kernels traveled best when packed into small pouches made from the dried inner bark of nearby salt-tolerant trees, pouches that could be tied to waist cords or slung across the chest for balance during long coastal treks. The back beach swales, low, sometimes waterlogged depressions between successive dune ridges, supported yet another layer, clumps of a rush-like plant with cylindrical stems topped by dark, bristly seed heads. These stems were hollow and filled with a spongy pith that held both moisture and a faint sweetness. The ancestors cut the youngest stems near the base with sharp shell fragments, then split them lengthwise to expose the pith, which was scraped out with fingernails or small sticks and eaten immediately for its cool, hydrating quality. When larger quantities were needed for travel, the pith was mashed into a coarse paste, mixed with crushed dune seed meal, and formed into short cylinders that dried to a chewy consistency in the wind. These pith cylinders became emergency rations during the windiest seasons when fresh leaves were torn away and succulent carpets scoured clean. A single cylinder could be gnawed slowly over half a day, releasing moisture and energy in measured amounts. The coordination system expanded into the most far-flung network yet devised. The river mouth hub remained the anchor, but secondary hubs now appeared every 20 to 30 kilometers along the coast, each one a semi-permanent cluster of driftwood platforms elevated on sand mounds, surrounded by concentric rings of shell-marked caches. These secondary hubs served as redistribution points. Northern bands sent southbound caravans carrying surplus scale leaf pellets and disc seed rolls, while southern bands sent northbound loads of scrub nut kernels and pith cylinders. Messengers chosen for their endurance and knowledge of tide tables ran the beach routes between hubs, carrying bundles of colored dune grass that encoded current conditions. One length for high tide access to succulent beds, 2 crossed lengths for dune shifts burying caches, 3 knotted together for abundant scrub nut ripening. The shell markers themselves evolved into a true code. Arrangements of 5, 7, or 9 shells in specific patterns indicated which type of food was stored beneath: pellets, rolls, kernels, cylinders, while small pieces of wave-polished glass or rare-colored shell denoted priority for redistribution to bands currently facing scarcity. Cache systems reached their largest scale here. Linear chains along the beach were now supplemented by radial spokes extending short distances inland to sheltered scrub patches and back beach swales. Each major cache consisted of multiple shallow pits, never deeper than an arm's length to avoid collapse, lined with layers of succulent leaves, packed with mixed rations from both coastal and delta sources, sealed with flat driftwood slabs, and covered with sand mounded into low, wind-resistant domes. Markers were triple redundant: shell patterns on the surface, colored grass tied to short stakes driven deep, and subtle arrangements of small beach stones forming directional arrows pointing toward the next cache in either direction. During the strongest storms, when sand moved in great sheets, the ancestors relied on the inland radial caches, which lay in more sheltered positions and often survived when beachfront pits were temporarily buried. Movement patterns refined themselves into a slow, seasonal migration wave that rolled along the entire known coastline. During the calmer, wetter months, the bands pushed farther in both directions, harvesting scale leaf cushions on high dunes, disc seed mats in swale hollows, scrub nut clusters in protected lee sides. Surplus was transported toward the nearest hub via foot caravans, using wide, flat reed mats dragged over firm sand, or in sheltered bays by small coastal rafts poled along the shallows. As winds strengthened and dunes shifted in the dry season, the wave contracted inward toward the hubs, drawing on the largest cache concentrations and the most reliable scrub patches. The entire pattern could now span hundreds of kilometers, yet every band remained connected through the hub-and-spoke system, the messenger runs and the shared tide and wind calendar maintained at the river mouth. Daily existence along these extended shores followed an intricate yet instinctive rhythm. Dawn light revealed the state of the tide. Low water sent parties to the uppermost beach for succulent harvesting, fingers moving in practiced arcs across the carpets. Mid-morning brought dune work, cushion scooping, seed beating, the labor shared so that no one remained exposed to the strengthening sun too long. By midday the groups sheltered in swale depressions or behind tall scrub, processing the haul, pounding scale leaf cores into pellets, rolling disc seed leaves, cracking scrub nuts, scraping rush pith. Afternoon travel occurred during the cooling onshore breeze, following the firmest sand or the subtle shell trails left by previous passages. Evenings were devoted to cache maintenance, marker adjustments, basket repairs, and the quiet sharing of rations around driftwood fires whose smoke curled low to avoid scattering signals to the wind. Across generations, this coastal expansion produced the widest distribution and greatest resilience the ancestors had ever known. Bodies adapted to the constant salt wind. Eyes developed finer protection against blowing particles, lungs grew accustomed to the heavier, mineral-laden air, feet broadened further for better purchase on shifting sand. Knowledge reached an almost encyclopedic depth. Elders could forecast dune movement by the angle of ripple marks after a night wind. Children learned the exact shell patterns for every cache type within a week's run. Bands developed regional specialties. Northern groups expert in scale leaf pellet production, southern groups renowned for pith cylinder preservation, that were deliberately exchanged through the hub system. The loose, distributed community now extended across entire coastal regions, food and information flowing in constant streams, resilience built not on isolation but on interconnection. Storms, shifting sands, prolonged high winds, and occasional saltwater incursions into back beach swales remain the enduring tests. Yet the sheer diversity of dune, scrub, and back beach plants, the vast scale of the cache networks, the precision of the coordination, and the enduring link to the Delta heartland ensured that scarcity, when it came, was always temporary and shared. The ancestors had carried their way of life to its farthest geographical reach, threading existence along thousands of kilometers of curving shore, mastering every subtle gradient of sand, wind, tide, and growth. As the coastal circuits reached their maximum extent and generations succeeded one another across the long beaches, some scouts began to turn their attention inland once more, following river valleys and scrub corridors that led away from the sea toward higher plateaus and distant mountain foothills where entirely new plant communities waited. The promise of further variety, combined with the possibility of linking the coastal delta system to these interior highlands, exerted its familiar, quiet pull. In the next part, we will follow those who ventured up the inland valleys and observe how the integration of upland herbs, highland tubers, and montane shrubs, supported by the most extensive long-distance exchange networks, largest multi-regional coordination, and most adaptive seasonal migrations yet created, permitted the ancestors to close one of the greatest chapters of their purely gathering existence. Achieving a resilience and distribution so complete that it seemed the earth itself had finally been fully understood in all its plant-given bounty before any other path to sustenance had ever been conceived. We will follow those who ventured up the inland valleys and observe how the integration of upland herbs, highland tubers, and montane shrubs, supported by the most extensive long-distance exchange networks, largest multi-regional coordination, and most adaptive seasonal migrations yet created, permitted the ancestors to close one of the greatest chapters of their purely gathering existence. Achieving a resilience and distribution so complete that it seemed the earth itself had finally been fully understood in all its plant-given bounty before any other path to sustenance had ever been conceived. The ascent began along the broader river valleys that fed the delta and the long coastline, where the familiar braided channels narrowed gradually into steeper, clearer streams cutting through rising foothills. The air grew thinner and cooler with every day's climb. The salt tang faded, replaced by the sharp resin of conifers and the clean bite of altitude. The sand and scrub of the coast gave way first to rolling grassy slopes dotted with scattered trees, then to steeper terraces where soil clung stubbornly to rock, supporting denser clusters of plants adapted to sharper changes in temperature and moisture. The ancestors moved in extended family bands now, each carrying the accumulated knowledge of generations spent on shore, in delta, and along dunes, yet still open to the new lessons the rising land offered. They did not climb in a single rush. Temporary foothill camps were established at regular intervals, each one a testing ground where coastal rations were compared to upland finds, where children learned to judge the angle of sunlight on a leaf as a sign of ripeness at higher elevation, where elders demonstrated how the same reed twisting technique used for coastal baskets could now secure bundles against mountain winds. In the lower valleys, where streams still ran warm from the lowlands, grew extensive patches of a tall, hollow-stemmed herb with feathery, divided leaves and clusters of small, pale flowers that matured into dry, papery seed capsules. These capsules split open along fine seams when fully ripe, releasing dozens of tiny winged seeds that drifted on the slightest updraft. The ancestors learned to harvest them during the brief window after the capsules dried, but before the wind carried the seeds away entirely. They would position themselves upslope on calm mornings, holding broad mats of woven valley grass beneath the tallest stems, then tap the capsules gently with long, flexible switches cut from nearby shrubs. The seeds rained down in soft flurries, collected in quantity because their lightness meant a single morning's work could fill several large carrying baskets. Processing was delicate. The winged seeds were rubbed between palms to remove the papery membranes, then ground on flat river stones worn smooth by generations of use into an exceptionally fine, almost powdery meal. This meal mixed easily with water from the clear mountain streams, forming a thin gruel that could be drunk warm or allowed to thicken into a portable paste dried on broad leaves in the sun. The lightness of the final product made it one of the most efficient long-distance foods yet devised. A single basket could sustain a band for many days while crossing the most exposed ridges. Higher up, where the valleys steepened and the streams ran colder, the ground supported dense colonies of a low-growing tuber plant with thick, leathery leaves arranged in tight rosettes close to the soil. The tubers themselves grew just beneath the surface in strings of knobby, irregular shapes, each one swollen with stored starch and water that had been accumulated during the brief wet season. Locating them required reading the land with new precision. The ancestors noticed that healthy rosettes had a slightly bluish tint to the leaf undersides, visible only when the plant was turned gently by hand. Digging was done with sharpened branches hardened in small fires, working in teams so that one person loosened the soil while others followed the string of tubers, pulling them free in long chains. The extracted tubers were cleaned by rolling them in coarse valley grass, then sliced into thin rounds with sharp shell fragments carried from the coast. These rounds could be eaten raw for their crisp, mildly earthy flavor and high moisture content, or laid out on flat rocks to dry slowly in the thin mountain air, becoming hard, lightweight discs that rehydrated quickly when soaked in stream water. A single productive colony could yield enough dried discs to supply an entire band for weeks during the leanest months when fresh growth above the tree line was scarce. At the upper limits of the valleys, where the slopes opened into broad alpine meadows before climbing toward true montane heights, stood scattered thickets of low, wind-twisted shrubs bearing clusters of small, dark berries enclosed in thin, papery bracts. The berries ripened in late summer to a deep purple black, their flesh tart and intensely flavorful, packed with tiny seeds that crunched pleasantly when chewed. The ancestors learned to time their arrival perfectly. Too early and the berries remained green and astringent. too late and the first frosts turned them to mush. Harvesting involved careful hand picking to avoid crushing the delicate skins. The clusters were twisted free and carried in shallow baskets lined with soft moss gathered from shaded rocks. On return to camp, the berries were spread thinly on broad leaves and allowed to dry partially in the cool shade beneath overhanging boulders, then mashed lightly into a dense paste that could be formed into small, sun-hardened cakes. These cakes retained much of their tart intensity and provided a sharp contrast to the blander tastes of tuber discs and seed gruel, lifting spirits during the long, cold nights when the group huddled together for warmth. The long-distance exchange networks that emerged linked the coastal hubs, the delta platforms, and now these upland camps into a single, breathing web that spanned from sea level to the edge of permanent snow. Runners chosen for their lung capacity at altitude and sure-footedness on steep trails carried baskets of coastal succulent pellets, delta pod cakes, and lowland marsh grain balls upward along the valleys, trading them for the light seed meal, dried tuber discs, and tart berry cakes that could not be produced below. The return journeys brought the highland foods down to the river mouth, where they were redistributed along the entire coastal circuit. Relay stations appeared at key elevation changes, a foothill camp where lowland porters handed loads to mid-valley runners, a mid-slope clearing where mid-valley runners passed to highland carriers who knew the steepest paths. Each station maintained its own cache cluster, pits lined with moss and sealed with flat stones, marked with combinations of colored moss tufts, notched sticks, and arrangements of river pebbles that encoded both contents and destination. The multi-regional coordination reached its most intricate form. A shared seasonal calendar was maintained at the river mouth hub, now expanded to include not only tidal and wind cycles, but also the timing of first frost at upper elevations, the exact week when alpine berry bracts began to dry, and the predictable patterns of afternoon-up valley winds that could carry light seed meal farther with less effort. Colored moss signals, bundles of specific lengths and hues tied to prominent rocks or trees, were placed along trails during each seasonal shift, visible from great distances and updated by runners so that every band, whether on the coast or in the high meadows, knew when to expect supply caravans or when to prepare surplus for downward transport. When an early frost threatened an upland berry harvest, swift messengers descended with knotted grass cords signaling urgent need. Coastal groups responded by sending extra succulent leaves and seed wafers upward to bridge the gap until the next season. Movement patterns adapted to the vertical dimension. The annual circuit now became a series of vertical oscillations synchronized across regions. During the warmer months, the bands climbed as high as the meadows allowed, harvesting seed capsules before the wind took them, digging tuber strings while the soil remained soft, picking berries at peak ripeness. Surplus was cached at mid-slope stations for later retrieval. As cold weather approached and frosts crept lower each night, the groups descended gradually, drawing on the caches and trading fresh highland foods for stored lowland rations that traveled better in the chill. The lowest camps near the valley mouths served as winter refuges, where coastal and delta supplies arrived in steady streams, allowing the entire network to endure the leanest months with minimal disruption. Daily life in the uplands followed a rhythm shaped by altitude and exposure. Dawn light on the eastern ridges brought the first movement. Parties ascended to the meadows while the ground was still frozen hard, harvesting seed capsules before the sun warmed the air and released the winged seeds. Mid-morning shifted to tuber digging in the shadier valley bottoms, where teams worked in shifts to avoid exhaustion on the thin air. By midday, the group sought wind-sheltered hollows beneath overhanging rock, processing the haul, winnowing seeds, slicing tubers, mashing berries, while chewing small portions of dried tuber discs to maintain energy. Afternoon travel occurred during the warmest hours, descending to lower caches or ascending to new patches as the seasonal wave required. Evenings were spent reinforcing high-altitude caches, repairing carrying baskets torn by thorny scrub, and sharing the days finds around small fires built in stone rings to contain heat against the dropping temperature. Across countless seasons, this vast, vertical and horizontal web produced the most complete resilience the ancestors had ever known. Bodies adapted to the full range of environments, lungs expanded for thin air, skin toughened against both salt wind and frost, hands grew even more precise from the delicate work of seed winnowing and berry picking at different elevations. Knowledge became encyclopedic. Elders could predict the exact day a high meadow would frost by watching the color change in certain shrub leaves far below. Children memorized the moss knot codes for every relay station along the longest valley routes. Bands developed specialized roles. Highland scouts who read frost patterns by starlight, lowland processors expert in preserving berry cakes against mold, mid-level runners who knew every shortcut through boulder fields. The distributed community now encompassed entire regions from open sea to alpine edge, food flowing upward and downward, information traveling faster than any single group could move, resilience forged not in isolation but in the constant living connection between coast, delta, valley, and height. Even here the earth still set boundaries. An unusually early or severe winter could bury high caches under early snow, forcing accelerated descent and stricter rationing. A prolonged dry spell at lower elevations could reduce stream flow and delay lowland harvests, requiring tighter coordination of upward supplies. Yet the extraordinary range of upland herbs, highland tubers, and montane shrubs, combined with the scale of the exchange networks, the precision of multi-regional signals, and the adaptive vertical migrations, meant that scarcity, when it arrived, was always temporary, shared, and mitigated by the collective memory and effort of countless interconnected bands. As the vertical circuits stabilized and generations succeeded one another across the full gradient from sea to snowline, some scouts began to look toward the true mountain passes, where the land rose still higher and new plant forms appeared in the thin air above the tree line. The promise of final extreme adaptations, combined with the possibility of closing the last unknown gaps in their understanding of the Earth's plant-given gifts, continued to draw them forward with the same quiet persistence that had carried them across dunes, deltas, valleys, and now toward the roof of their world. In the final part, we will accompany those who crossed the high passes and witness how the mastery of the last, harshest alpine and subalpine plant communities, woven into the ultimate continent-spanning coordination, the most enduring cache legacies, and the most profound seasonal harmony yet achieved, completed the long arc of their purely gathering existence, bringing to full circle a way of life so perfectly attuned to every corner of the living landscape that it seemed no further refinement could ever be required in a world still nourished solely by what grew from the ground, hung from branches, or rose from the soil in endless, patient cycles of renewal. Beyond the last meadow terraces, the trails narrowed into true mountain passes, narrow defiles flanked by sheer rock walls, where wind funneled upward in constant streams and the sun struck at sharp angles even at midday. The air thinned until each breath felt deliberate, frost rimed the stones even in summer mornings, and the sky darkened to a deeper blue that made distant peaks appear closer than they were. The ancestors crossed these divides in small, carefully chosen parties, elders who remembered the patterns of previous ascents, strong carriers accustomed to heavy loads at altitude, and young observers whose eyes had not yet learned every trick of the high country. They moved slowly, resting often, chewing small portions of dried tuber discs and tart berry cakes brought from below to keep the blood moving in the cold. Every step upward was a test of the entire lineage. Could the knowledge accumulated across coast, delta, valley, and foothills still serve when the earth itself grew sparse and unforgiving? Above the tree line, the world simplified into rock, sky, and the stubborn plants that clung to life wherever a pocket of soil had collected. In the lee of boulders and along the edges of snowmelt trickles grew the first true high alpine specialists, low cushions of a tiny, densely packed herb whose leaves were reduced to minute scales overlapping like roof tiles. These cushions hugged the ground so tightly that wind passed over rather than through, and the plant itself became its own shelter. The ancestors learned to recognize them by the faint gray-green color that stood out against bare stone when the light was right. Harvesting was almost meditative. A single finger traced the edge of the cushion, lifting it just enough to expose the denser core beneath the scales. The core, small, pale, and surprisingly starchy, was scraped free with a fingernail or a thin flake of sharp rock. Each plant yielded only a few pinches, yet the density of nourishment was extraordinary. A morning's careful collection from dozens of cushions could provide enough core material to sustain a small party for several days when mixed with water from melting snow and formed into tiny, sun-dried nuggets. These nuggets were the ultimate emergency food, impervious to cold, light enough to carry in quantity, and releasing slow energy when chewed patiently against the constant drain of altitude. In the wetter hollows fed by persistent snowfields grew another form, rosettes of thick, spoon-shaped leaves surrounding short, swollen rootstocks buried just below the thin soil. The leaves were waxy and slightly succulent, designed to trap every drop of moisture from fog or brief rain. The rootstocks, pale, almost translucent when peeled, held concentrated carbohydrates accumulated over multiple short growing seasons. The ancestors developed a two-person technique for extraction. One held the rosette steady while the other used a sharpened antler tine, carried from lower valleys where such animals had once been observed from afar, to loosen the soil in a circle around the base. With gentle rocking, the entire rootstock could be lifted free without breaking. The leaves were eaten fresh for their crisp moisture, the rootstocks sliced thinly and dried on warm rocks during the brief sunny intervals. The dried slices rehydrated in any trickle of snowmelt, regaining much of their original texture and providing a steady, almost creamy fullness that countered the hollow-feeling altitude often brought to the stomach. Scattered across the highest, most exposed ridges stood the last category, low, prostrate shrubs with needle-like leaves and clusters of tiny, resin-scented seed cones that matured into hard, brown capsules. These capsules protected small, oil-rich seeds that could withstand freezing temperatures and drying winds. The ancestors timed their passage across these ridges to coincide with the brief period when the capsules began to open naturally under the intense ultraviolet light of high altitude. They would collect the fallen capsules in shallow baskets woven from tough alpine grass stems, then crack them open between two flat stones carried specifically for the purpose. The seeds inside were dark and glossy, their oil content so high that a small handful produced a perceptible warmth when chewed slowly. These seeds were never eaten in large quantities at once. Instead, they were ground coarsely and mixed with melted snow to form a thin paste that could be carried in small leaf packets sealed with pine resin gathered from lower conifers. The paste provided concentrated calories and a subtle resinous flavor that lingered, helping to mask the metallic taste that sometimes accompanied prolonged exertion at extreme heights. The ultimate coordination system that unified this final frontier with every landscape below was breathtaking in its scope and simplicity. The river mouth hub had evolved into a true knowledge center. Driftwood poles now bore hundreds of notches recording not only tides and winds, but also the date of first alpine snowmelt observed by returning runners, the exact week when high rosette rootstocks reached maximum swelling, and the predictable intervals between clear sky periods when seed capsules opened most reliably. Colored moss, grass, and now small dyed threads made from plant fibers carried signals across the entire span. A particular knot and color combination meant high cushion cores abundant, send upward more lowland seed meal. Another signaled early frost descending, draw from mid-valley caches and hold position. Runners moved in relays that spanned weeks. Coastal messengers handed loads to valley carriers at foothill stations. Valley carriers passed to mid-slope runners. Mid-slope runners transferred to high-altitude specialists who knew every safe ledge and snow-free traverse. The entire network operated on a shared understanding that no band was ever truly alone. Every cache, every harvest, every journey contributed to the survival of all. The cache legacy reached its most permanent form in these heights. High-altitude storage sites were no longer simple pits but carefully constructed rock cairns. Flat stones arranged in low domes over natural crevices, lined with multiple layers of waxy alpine leaves and moss, packed with mixtures of nugget cores, dried rootstock slices, resin seed paste, and imported lowland foods that traveled better in the cold. The cairns were built to withstand wind and snow load, their outer surfaces camouflaged with loose scree so they blended into the surrounding talus. Each bore a unique marker, 3 small quartz fragments arranged in a triangle for cushion cores, 5 in a line for rootstock slices, 7 in a circle for seed paste, visible from a distance yet meaningless to any eye not trained in the code. These cairns could remain intact for years. When a band returned after several seasons, they often found their stores undisturbed, the contents still dry and nourishing despite the intervening freezes. Seasonal harmony achieved a near-perfect equilibrium. The annual cycle now encompassed the full vertical and horizontal expanse, coast and delta during the wettest, warmest months when succulent and marsh resources peaked, lower valleys during the transition seasons when seed capsules and tuber strings were ready, high meadows and alpine zones during the brief summer window when cushions, rosettes, and seed cones could be harvested before the first permanent snow. As autumn approached and frost lines descended, the movement reversed in a slow, cascading withdrawal. High parties descended with their lightweight, calorie-dense foods to restock mid-level caches. Mid-level bands moved downward, carrying both highland surplus and their own preserved tubers and berries. Valley groups traded upward the last of the lowland grain balls and fruit sheets before retreating to coastal winter refuges where delta and shoreline rations waited in abundance. The entire wave took months to complete, yet every segment remained synchronized through the relay signals and the shared calendar maintained at the hub. Daily existence in the highest reaches was austere yet deeply rhythmic. Dawn brought the first light on distant snowfields. Parties moved immediately to sheltered hollows where cushions and rosettes grew, working quickly while the ground remained frozen and the plants were easiest to lift intact. Mid-morning shifted to ridge-top capsule collection when the sun had warmed the rock enough to open the last sealed pods. By midday, the groups sheltered behind boulders or in shallow caves, processing the morning's finds, scraping cushion cores, slicing rootstocks, cracking seed capsules, while melting snow in small stone bowls warmed by body heat or tiny fires. Afternoon travel followed the sun's arc across the ridges, descending slightly to reach known cairns or ascending to new patches as the seasonal window narrowed. Evenings were spent reinforcing cairns, repairing baskets frayed by sharp rock, and sharing tiny portions of resin seed paste around fires so small they produced almost no smoke. Across the final generations, this complete attunement produced a way of life that felt eternal. Bodies adapted to the extremes. Hearts grew stronger to pump in thin air, skin thickened against ultraviolet and cold, senses sharpened to detect the faintest scent of resin or the subtle color shift of a healthy cushion against gray stone. Knowledge reached its fullest depth. Elders could forecast the breaking of an autumn storm by the exact pattern of cloud shadows on distant peaks. Children memorized the cairn codes for every pass within a season's journey. Bands developed roles so specialized yet interdependent that the whole functioned as a single organism. High scouts who read snow lines by star positions, processors expert in sealing paste against freeze-thaw cycles, long-distance runners whose lungs and legs carried messages across valleys in days rather than weeks. Challenges persisted to the end. An exceptionally severe winter could seal the high passes for months longer than expected, forcing extended reliance on cached and imported foods. A sudden rockfall could bury a cairn, requiring rapid rediscovery and relocation of its contents. Yet the sheer scope of the system, the continent-spanning exchanges, the permanent care network, the precise vertical timing, the unbreakable links between every landscape from deepest delta to highest ridge, meant that no disruption ever became catastrophe. Food always reached those who needed it, knowledge always flowed where it was required, resilience was no longer individual or even communal but woven into the very structure of the inhabited earth, and so the long arc closed. The ancestors had walked from the first scattered woodlands through savannas, floodplains, deltas, coasts, valleys, and now to the roof of their world. They had learned every plant that offered sustenance, every season that governed its growth, every technique that preserved its gift, every path that connected one bounty to another. They had built a way of life so attuned to the rhythms of sun, rain, tide, wind, frost, and soil that hunger became rare, isolation impossible, and uncertainty reduced to manageable patterns. No animal had ever been harmed for food. No creature had ever been seen as anything but part of the same living tapestry they themselves inhabited. The earth had provided, and they had listened with complete attention for countless generations. In the quiet evenings around the last high fires, when the stars burned brighter than anywhere below, and the silence was broken only by the distant rumble of a glacier shifting, they sometimes looked back across the vast distance they had traveled, not in miles alone, but in understanding. They had come to know the land not as something separate, but as an extension of their own bodies. The succulent carpets of the shore were their hydration, the marsh grains of the delta their steady strength, the alpine cushions their final reserve of endurance. Every cache cairn was a promise kept across time, every relay runner a thread in an unbroken cord, every shared meal a renewal of the ancient agreement with the green world. The long arc closed. The ancestors had walked from the first scattered woodlands through savannas, floodplains, deltas, coasts, valleys, and now to the roof of their world. They had learned every plant that offered sustenance, every season that governed its growth, every technique that preserved its gift, every path that connected one bounty to another. They had built a way of life so attuned to the rhythms of sun, rain, tide, wind, frost, and soil that hunger became rare, isolation impossible, and uncertainty reduced to manageable patterns. No animal had ever been harmed for food. No creature had ever been seen as anything but part of the same living tapestry they themselves inhabited. The earth had provided, and they had listened with complete attention for countless generations. Yet even in that profound equilibrium, the story does not end with stillness. The high passes themselves were never a final boundary. They were a vantage point from which the ancestors could see farther still, down into shadowed inner basins, across frost-rimmed plateaus, toward ranges that folded one upon another like the pages of an unfinished book. Some bands, driven by the same quiet curiosity that had once pulled them out of the first woodlands, began across those passes not merely to gather, but to map, to understand, to weave the last unknown threads into the great web they had already spun. In the rain-shadow basins beyond the highest ridges lay a different kind of land, cold, dry, open, yet pierced by narrow green corridors where springs emerged from deep rock fractures and fed linear oases of hardy vegetation. Here the ancestors encountered plants shaped by extremes of aridity and cold that no previous landscape had demanded. Along the spring-fed channels grew a low, woody perennial with small, rolled leaves covered in fine silver hairs that reflected sunlight and trapped what little moisture the air offered. These leaves, though tiny, were intensely aromatic when crushed between the fingers. The aroma itself carried a faint stimulant quality that sharpened the senses in the thin, oxygen-poor air. The ancestors learned to chew a single leaf slowly during the steepest ascents, letting the volatile oils release gradually to ease the ache in lungs and legs. The true treasure of these oases, however, lay below ground, a cluster-forming geophyte whose storage organs were flattened, disc-like corms wrapped in papery tunics that protected them from desiccation and freeze. Each corm was no larger than a thumbnail, yet packed with dense, almost sugary starch accumulated over years of brief, wet pulses. Digging them required patience and knowledge of subtle surface signs, the slight mound where a single withered leaf stalk protruded, the way certain insects burrowed preferentially near healthy colonies. Once extracted, the corms were peeled of their tunics with a thumbnail, then either eaten raw, their texture crisp yet yielding a slow sweetness, or sliced and dried on warm south-facing rocks. The dried slices could be pounded into a coarse meal later, mixed with melted snow and a pinch of aromatic leaf powder, creating a sustaining gruel that warmed the body from within during the long, star-filled nights when temperatures dropped far below freezing. On the open plateaus between the basin oases grew yet another form, prostrate mats of a cushion plant whose individual rosettes fused into almost continuous carpets, the whole surface bristling with needle-sharp leaf tips that deterred the drying wind. Beneath this armored surface hid tender growing points and short, swollen storage stems filled with mucilaginous sap. The ancestors developed a precise harvesting method. They would press a flat stone gently onto the mat to expose a small area, then use a thin, pointed bone sliver, shaped from fragments found lower down, to excise only the swollen stem without destroying the protective rosette. The extracted stems were translucent and jelly-like, yielding a cool, viscous fluid when chewed that coated the mouth and throat, preventing the raw dryness that high, cold winds inflicted. Surplus stems were carefully wrapped in layers of the same needle-tipped leaves, used inverted so the sharp points faced outward, and cached in crevices beneath overhanging boulders where the natural insulation of rock kept them from freezing solid. The highest wind-swept calls and saddles supported only the most extreme specialists, scattered individuals of a dwarf woody sub-shrub whose branches hugged the ground in tight, contorted spirals and whose leaves had been reduced to overlapping scales impregnated with natural antifreeze compounds. At the tip of each season's new growth appeared minute, capsule-like structures containing a few dozen dust-fine seeds coated in a waxy film. These seeds were so small that a single capsule yielded barely enough to cover a fingernail, yet their oil content was astonishing, enough that crushing a handful between stones produced a tiny droplet that could be smeared on the lips to prevent cracking in the desiccating air. The ancestors collected these capsules one by one, using the soft inner wool of certain lower elevation plants as padding inside tiny pouches made from cured hide scraps, obtained from naturally shed fragments observed far below. A single pouch no larger than a child's thumb could hold the harvest of an entire day and provide enough oil-rich dust to sustain lip and skin integrity for weeks. The continent-spanning coordination reached its final, almost architectural form. The river mouth hub, the coastal secondary hubs, the valley relay stations, the mid-slope clearings, all were now linked to a thin but unbreakable chain of high-pass way stations, small rock shelters improved with windbreaks of stacked stone and insulated with layers of dried cushion mats. Each way station maintained a permanent memory cairn, a carefully built pile in which flat stones were inscribed with simple pictographic marks using charcoal from valley fires. A spiral for the aromatic leaf shrub, a disc for the corm clusters, a needle pattern for the mucilage stems, a dot cluster for the seed dust. These marked stones were added to or rearranged by every passing band, creating a living archive of abundance and scarcity across the years. When a runner arrived from below carrying lowland grain balls or coastal succulent pellets, the way station keeper would place a corresponding marker. When highland foods were sent downward, another marker moved. In this way, the entire network could read the state of the whole system without a single word spoken. The cache legacy became monumental. In the most sheltered high calls, the ancestors constructed true long-term vaults. Natural rock clefts widened slightly by hand, lined floor to ceiling with alternating layers of aromatic leaves for scent and insect deterrence, cushion mats for insulation, and moss for moisture control, then packed with every type of preserved food from every region below and above. The entrances were sealed with fitted stone slabs caulked with resin paste, and the exterior disguised so perfectly that only someone who knew the exact alignment of three distant peaks could locate the correct cleft. Inside these vaults, foods from the coast could survive for decades beside highland corms and seed dust. The slow, cold preservation environment allowed cross-seasonal carryover that no previous cache system had achieved. When an exceptionally hard winter sealed a pass for 2 full cycles, bands descending from above could still find enough sealed surplus to re-establish themselves below without collapse. Seasonal harmony now operated on a multi-generational timescale. The upward wave began in the warmest months with the coastal and delta peak, continued through valley seed and tuber harvests, accelerated into the brief Alpine window for cushions and rosettes, and culminated in the high pass collection of aromatic leaves, corms, mucilage stems, and seed dust just before the first permanent snow closed the roots. The downward wave reversed the process in mirror image, carrying highland rarities to lower elevations where they served as tonics, trade goods, and emergency reserves during lowland shortages. The entire oscillation took a full solar year to complete one full traverse from sea level to the highest calls and back, yet because of the vault caches and memory cairns, no single season's failure could break the continuity. Daily existence at these altitudes was reduced to its most elemental rhythm. Dawn light touched the highest peaks first. The party rose immediately, chewing a single aromatic leaf to awaken the lungs. Morning hours were spent on the most exposed ridges collecting seed capsules, while the sun had not yet warmed them enough to scatter the dust. Midday brought retreat to the lee of large boulders, where small fires of dry cushion stems provided just enough heat to melt snow in stone bowls without wasting fuel. Processing occurred in silence, grinding seed dust into paste, slicing corms, scraping mucilage stems, scraping cushion cores, all done with movements so practiced they required no conscious thought. Afternoon travel followed the sun's arc, always downward if possible, toward the next way station or vault. Evenings were spent checking and adding to memory cairns, resealing vault entrances, sharing minute portions of seed paste around the tiniest possible flame, and listening to the wind that never ceased. In this final refinement, the ancestors achieved something close to timelessness. Bodies became leaner yet more enduring, hearts enlarged to move blood in thin air, red blood cells increased, senses tuned to detect the faintest moisture gradient in rock or the distant scent of aromatic leaves carried on an updraft. Knowledge reached a state of near completeness. Every viable plant in every reachable niche had been catalogued, every seasonal cue memorized across multiple generations, every path, pass, cairn, vault, and marker integrated into collective memory so deeply that it felt instinctive. The distributed community now truly spanned a continent's breadth and height. No band was ever more than a few relay stages from help, no harvest ever entirely lost, no winter ever absolute. And yet even here the earth still whispered of limits. A volcanic winter could shroud the sun for years, collapsing the brief growing windows at every elevation. A shifting tectonic fracture could close a pass forever, severing a chain. But these were catastrophes shared across the whole web. The vaults, the memory cairns, the runners, the accumulated wisdom ensured that even after such events the threads could be re-tied, the patterns slowly relearned, the balance restored. Thus the history of that immense, patient era reaches its natural cadence, not with drama or rupture, but with quiet saturation. The ancestors had come to inhabit every livable fold of their world without ever needing to take life to sustain their own. They had turned gathering into an art so refined it bordered on ceremony, every step a harvest, every season a collaboration, every generation a deepening of trust with the green pulse beneath their feet. In the silence between breaths at the top of the world, when the only sounds were wind over rock and the soft crackle of a cushion stem fire, they sometimes felt the entire journey echo back, every fruit plucked, every root dug, every seed winnowed, every cache sealed, as a single, unbroken gesture of attention and gratitude. And so they lived on, season folding into season, range into range, until the very distinction between people and place dissolved into something seamless. The earth had fed them completely, they had answered with complete remembrance. No further chapter was required. The long story of eating only what the land freely gave simply continued, quietly, endlessly, perfectly in time with the turning world.